I am just a chronicler and welcome you to another video. Since I know many of you watch to relax and fall asleep, I thought it would be nice if you left a comment telling me where you're listening from and if it's raining there. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying the episodes. Now, it's time to get comfortable, relax, and begin. I should have known better than to trust my GPS on these back roads. But how else was I supposed to get home? It was supposed to be a simple 3-hour drive back from my cousin's wedding. But here I was, God knows where, with nothing but darkness pressing in on all sides of my car. The clock on my dashboard read 11:43 p.m. I'd been driving for nearly 5 hours. It all started when I hit that massive traffic jam on the highway. Cars stretched out in front of me as far as I could see, their brake lights blinking like some kind of hellish Christmas display. After inching forward for what felt like an eternity, I decided to get clever. I pulled up my phone's GPS and searched for an alternate route. In 500 feet, turn right onto Old Mill Road, the robotic voice instructed. I breathed a sigh of relief as I steered onto the exit ramp. The back roads would be darker and probably a bit creepy, but at least I'd be moving. For the first hour, everything seemed fine. The roads twisted and turned through dense forest, but my headlights cut through the darkness well enough. I even started to enjoy the drive a little. The stars were brighter out here, away from the city lights. I rolled down my window, letting the cool night air wash over me. That's when things started to get weird. I first noticed it when I passed an old, rusted-out pickup truck on the side of the road. Its hood was up, and it looked like it had been abandoned there for years. I didn't think much of it at the time, but 10 minutes later, I swear I passed the exact same truck again. Same rust pattern, same angle, even the same broken reflector on the ground nearby. Calm down, I told myself. It's dark. All these old trucks looked the same, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I glanced at my phone's GPS. The little blue dot showing my location was moving along the prescribed route, but the estimated arrival time kept getting pushed back. 45 minutes, then an hour and 15 minutes. I tried to rationalize it. These back roads were probably just longer than the GPS originally calculated. But a gnawing sense of unease was growing in the pit of my stomach. That's when I saw the sign. Welcome to Millbrook, it read in faded letters. A wave of relief washed over me. Finally, a town. Maybe I could stop and ask for directions, or at least confirm I was heading the right way. But as I drove through Millbrook, something felt wrong. The streets were completely deserted. Not a single car, not a single pedestrian. Every house was dark. It was like driving through a ghost town. I pulled over and tried to pull up Millbrook on my phone's map. Nothing, according to my GPS. I was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but forests for miles. This is insane, I muttered, running a hand through my hair. I must have made a wrong turn somewhere. I decided to backtrack. I'd find my way back to the highway, even if it meant sitting in traffic all night. But as I drove back the way I came, the welcome to Millbrook sign was nowhere to be found. The town had vanished as quickly as it had appeared. My heart was really pounding now. I tried to focus on my breathing, to stay calm, but every shadow seemed to move in the corners of my vision. Every tree looked like it was reaching out to grab my car. That's when I saw the gas station up ahead. Its fluorescent lights cut through the darkness like a beacon of hope. I pulled in, my tires crunching on the gravel lot. The station looked ancient with old-fashioned pumps and a faded sign advertising 89-cent coffee. But it was open, and at that point, I would have welcomed any sign of human life. I killed the engine and stepped out of the car. The silence was oppressive. No crickets, no distant traffic, not even the hum of the gas station's lights. Just dead silence. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting strange shadows across the cluttered shelves. "Hello," I called out. No answer. I made my way to the counter. An ancient cash register sat there, coated in a thick layer of dust. Next to it was a yellow piece of paper. My blood ran cold as I read the handwritten note. "Turn back. You don't want to see what comes next." I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my ears. This had to be some kind of sick joke. I spun around, ready to bolt for my car. That's when I saw him. An old man, standing in the doorway. His eyes were milky white, unseeing. But somehow, I knew he was looking right at me. "You shouldn't have come here, son," he said, his voice like gravel. "This road, it doesn't like visitors." I tried to speak, but my mouth was dry as sandpaper. "What do you mean?" I finally managed to croak out. The old man took a shuffling step forward. "This road has a mind of its own. It'll keep you driving in circles until you're nothing but bones behind the wheel." I edged toward the door, keeping my eyes on the old man. How? How do I get out?" A mirthless chuckle escaped his lips. "That's the thing, son. You don't," I bolted. I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of the gas station, gravel spraying behind me. I drove like a madman, taking turns at random, desperate to find my way back to familiar territory, but every road looked the same in the darkness. Every curve, every hill, it all blended together into a nightmare labyrinth. I don't know how long I drove. Hours, maybe. The gas gauge was dropping dangerously low. My eyes burned from straining against the darkness. That's when I saw it. The rusted-out pickup truck. Again, I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop. This was impossible. I'd been driving for hours, taking random turns. How could I end up back here? I got out of the car, my legs shaky. The truck sat there, a silent sentinel in the night. I approached it slowly, drawn by a morbid curiosity. The driver's side door creaked as I pulled it open. The interior was covered in a thick layer of dust, and there, on the seat, was another handwritten note. "I tried to warn you. I'm sorry." The handwriting was my own. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. It didn't make any sense. I got back in my car, hands shaking as I turned the key. The engine sputtered once, twice, and died. Panic clawed at my throat. I tried the key again. Nothing. Not even a click. That's when I noticed the clock on my dashboard. 11:43 p.m. The exact same time I had first noticed it, hours ago. A movement in my rearview mirror caught my eye. A figure shambling out of the darkness. As it got closer, I could make out more details. The tattered clothes, the shuffling gait. It was me. An older version, weathered by years of endless driving. His eyes met mine in the mirror, filled with a mixture of pity and resignation. I wanted to scream, to run, to wake up from this nightmare. But I was frozen in place, watching as my future self approached the car. He leaned down, pressing a piece of paper against my window. With trembling hands, I rolled down the window and took it. Turned back, it read in my handwriting, "You don't want to see what comes next." As I looked up from the note, my other self was gone, vanished into the night as if he'd never been there. The engine suddenly roared to life, startling me. The GPS on my phone blinked, recalculating the route. "In 500 feet, turn right onto Old Mill Road," the robotic voice instructed. I sat there, paralyzed with indecision. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to find another way home. But a strange compulsion tugged at me, urging me forward. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time I'd break the loop. With a deep breath, I put the car in drive. The road stretched out before me, dark and unknowable. I turned right onto Old Mill Road. The clock read 11:43 p.m. and the drive began again. Story 2. The gentle hum of my computer was the only sound breaking the silence of the office. I glanced at the clock in the corner of my screen. 9:47 p.m. I'd been so engrossed in finishing this project that I'd lost track of time. Again, I leaned back in my chair, stretching my arms above my head and feeling the satisfying pop of my spine. That's when I first noticed something was off. The usual background noise of the office, the whir of the air conditioning, the occasional ping of the elevator, the distant murmur of the cleaning crew. It was all gone. Just silence. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet. No response. I stood up, my chair squeaking slightly. The motion-activated lights in my area flickered on, illuminating my desk and the surrounding cubicles. But beyond that, darkness. A shiver ran down my spine. I'd stayed late plenty of times before, but I'd never seen the office this empty. There were always a few other workaholics burning the midnight oil, or at least the cleaning staff making their rounds. "Get it together, Alex," I muttered to myself. "Everyone probably just left early. It's fine." I gathered my things, shoving my laptop into my bag. The sooner I got out of here, the better. I'd finished the project at home. As I walked towards the elevator, the lights activated section by section, creating a path through the darkness. Each illuminated area revealed nothing but empty desks and silent machines. No half-empty coffee mugs or jackets left on chairs. It was as if everyone had simply vanished. I quickened my pace, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. The elevator couldn't come fast enough. I jabbed at the down button repeatedly, willing the doors to open. Nothing happened. I pressed it again and again. The button remained unlit, the elevator silent. Come on," I whispered, a note of panic creeping into my voice. I turned to the emergency stairwell. It would be a long walk down from the 47th floor, but at least I'd be out of this eerily empty office. I pushed on the door. It didn't budge. I threw my weight against it, but it was like pushing against a solid wall. The emergency exit was sealed shut. My heart was really pounding now. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a dream, right? I pinched myself hard, wincing at the pain. Nope, definitely awake. I pulled out my phone, ready to call. Someone, security, the police. But as I looked at the screen, my blood ran cold. No signal, not even a single bar. "Okay, Alex, think. There's got to be a rational explanation for this," I said aloud, trying to calm myself. My voice sounded small and scared in the vast emptiness of the office. I decided to do a lap of the floor. Maybe I'd missed something. Maybe there was someone else here, equally confused. I set off, the lights activating as I moved, creating a bubble of illumination in the darkness. As I walked, I noticed things I'd never paid attention to before. The way the carpet muffled my footsteps, the slight flicker of the fluorescent lights, the eerie reflections in the floor-to-ceiling windows that lined one side of the building. I paused at those windows, looking out at the city below. The streets were empty. New cars, new pedestrians, just empty roads stretching out in all directions. In the other buildings, they were dark. All of them. As if the entire city had been abandoned. A movement caught my eye, and I spun around, heart in my throat. But it was just my reflection in the glass. Pale, wide-eyed, scared. But then I noticed something else in the reflection. A figure standing in the darkness behind me. Just a silhouette, barely visible. I whirled around, but there was nothing there. Just empty office space. I backed away from the windows, my breath coming in short gasps. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. As I moved, something on one of the desks caught my eye. A steaming cup of coffee. I approached it cautiously. The liquid inside was still moving slightly, as if it had just been set down. "Hello," I called out again, louder this time. "Is anyone there?" The silence that answered was deafening. I continued my circuit of the office, every sense on high alert. Each cubicle I passed was immaculate, as if it had never been used. No personal items, no clutter, just empty desks and blank computer screens. As I neared my own desk again, I noticed something different. My computer was on. I was sure I'd turned it off before I left. I approached slowly, warily. On the screen was a document I didn't recognize. At the top, in large font, were the words, "We've been waiting for you, Alex." My blood turned to ice. I stumbled backward, knocking over a chair in my haste. The crash echoed through the empty office, impossibly loud. And then, in the silence that followed, I heard it. Footsteps, coming from the darkness beyond the illuminated area. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. The footsteps stopped. Then, slowly, deliberately, they began again. Coming closer, I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to get away. I sprinted past rows of empty cubicles, the lights flickering on as I passed. The footsteps behind me quickened, matching my pace. I reached the far end of the office, gasping for breath. The elevator was there, and to my shock, the button was now illuminated. Without thinking, I pressed it. To my amazement, I heard the familiar ding. The doors slid open, revealing the brightly lit interior. Safety, escape. I dove inside, jabbing frantically at the ground floor button. As the doors began to close, I caught a glimpse of a figure emerging from the darkness. But before I could make out any details, the doors shut with a final, decisive click. I sagged against the wall, relief washing over me. The elevator began its descent, the floor numbers ticking down on the display above the door. 46, 45, 44. But then something strange happened. Instead of continuing down, the numbers began to climb. 45, 46, 47. No, 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 I muttered, pressing the ground floor button again and again. But the elevator continued to rise. 48, 49, 50. We were going beyond the top floor of the building. The elevator picked up speed, the numbers blurring as they climbed higher and higher. My stomach lurched with a rapid ascent. 60, 70, 80. Suddenly, everything stopped. The display showed a number I'd never seen before. 99. The doors slid open with a cheerful ding. Beyond them was nothing. An empty, white void stretched out as far as I could see. No floor, no walls, just endless white. A voice spoke from behind me, making me jump. "We've been waiting for you, Alex." I turned slowly, dreading what I might see, but the elevator was empty. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want?" "We want you to join us, Alex," the voice replied. It was familiar somehow, but I couldn't place it. Step out. Become part of something greater. I stood frozen, torn between the familiar confines of the elevator and the unknown expanse beyond. The white void seemed to pulse, to beckon. I don't understand," I stammered. "You will," the voice assured me. "Just take that first step." I found myself moving forward, drawn by an irresistible force. My foot hovered over the threshold between the elevator and the void. In that moment, I had a choice. Step back into the elevator, back into the fear and confusion of the empty office, or step forward into the unknown, into whatever awaited me in that white expanse. My foot moved forward. As it made contact with the void, I felt a jolt of something. Energy, consciousness. I couldn't describe it, but in that moment, I understood. The empty office, the abandoned city, the endless elevator ride. It had all been a test, a preparation. I took another step and another. With each one, I felt myself changing, expanding. I was becoming part of something vast, something beyond my previous understanding. The elevator dinged one final time behind me. As the doors closed, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the polished metal. But it wasn't me anymore. At least, not the me I had been. I smiled, and behind me, in the white void, countless others smiled back. We had been waiting for Alex for a very long time, and now, finally, we were complete. Story 3. The crunch of leaves under my boots was oddly satisfying. As I set off down the trail, the air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. It was the perfect day for a hike, and I was determined to make the most of it. I had chosen this trail because it was supposed to be challenging but manageable for a solo hiker. The park ranger had assured me it was well marked, and that I'd be back before sunset if I kept a steady pace. "Just follow the blue blazes," he'd said with a friendly smile. "They'll lead you right to the summit and back." The first blue marker was right where it should be, a splash of bright color against the bark of an old oak. I snapped a quick picture with my phone before continuing on. It was a habit I'd picked up on previous hikes. Document the journey, just in case. For the first hour, everything was perfect. The trail wound through dense forest, occasionally opening up to reveal breathtaking views of the valley below. I passed a few other hikers heading in the opposite direction, exchanging brief nods and hellos as we crossed paths. It was as I was taking a water break that I noticed something odd. The blue blaze on the tree in front of me seemed different, larger, somehow, and a shade darker than the others I'd seen. I shrugged it off, figuring it was just a trick of the light filtering through the leaves. But as I continued on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The trail markers were becoming more frequent, appearing every few yards instead of every 100 feet or so, and each one seemed slightly different from the last. Some larger, some smaller, some a deep navy while others were almost cyan. I pulled out my phone, intending to check my location on the trail map I'd downloaded. No signal, of course. I should have expected that this deep in the woods. It's fine, I muttered to myself. Just follow the blazes. That's what the ranger said. So I pressed on, trying to ignore the growing unease in the pit of my stomach. The forest seemed to be getting denser, the trees pressing in closer on either side of the trail. The cheerful bird song that had accompanied the start of my hike had faded away, replaced by an oppressive silence. I checked my watch. 2:30 p.m. I'd been hiking for 3 hours, which meant I should be nearing the summit, but the trail showed no signs of ending. If anything, it seemed to be leading me deeper into the woods. That's when I saw it. A blue blaze that was unmistakably different from the others. It wasn't painted on a tree, but rather on a large, moss-covered boulder, and it wasn't just a simple rectangle. This mark was intricate, almost like a symbol or glyph. I approached it cautiously, my heartbeat quickening. As I got closer, I realized the mark wasn't paint at all. It seemed to be glowing, faintly, pulsing with a soft blue light. "What the hell?" I whispered, reaching out to touch it. The moment my fingers made contact, a jolt of energy shot up my arm. I jerked back with a yelp, stumbling and nearly losing my footing on the uneven ground. That's when I heard it. A whisper, so faint I thought I might have imagined it. This way, I spun around, searching for the source of the voice. But there was nothing. Just trees and silence. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet forest. No response. I turned back to the boulder, intending to give it a wide berth as I continued down the trail. But it was gone. In its place was a narrow path I hadn't noticed before, leading off into a part of the forest that seemed darker, more primeval. I hesitated. Everything I knew about hiking safety told me to turn back, to retrace my steps and find my way back to the trailhead. But something was pulling me forward. A curiosity, a compulsion I couldn't explain. Just a little further, I told myself, just to see where it goes. I stepped onto the new path. The moment I did, the forest around me seemed to change. The trees grew taller, their branches intertwining overhead to block out most of the sunlight. The air became thick and heavy, filled with dancing motes of dust or pollen that glowed faintly in what little light filtered through. And the trail markers, they were everywhere now. Glowing blue symbols on every tree, every rock, every surface. Some I recognized from before, others were new and even more complex. They seemed to pulse in unison, creating a hypnotic rhythm that matched the beating of my heart. I don't know how long I walked. Time seemed to lose all meaning in this strange, twilight world. My watch had stopped at 2:30, its hands refusing to move no matter how many times I checked it. The whispers grew stronger as I continued. Sometimes they seemed to come from the trees themselves, other times from just behind me. But every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. Almost there. Just a little further. "We've been waiting for you." I wanted to run, to turn back, but my feet kept moving forward as if they had a will of their own. The path grew narrower, the symbols more intricate and bizarre. They no longer looked like trailblazers at all, but like some ancient, forgotten language. And then, suddenly, the path opened up into a clearing. In the center stood a massive tree, its trunk easily 20 feet in diameter. Its branches reached up and out, seeming to encompass the entire sky. But it was what was on the tree that made my blood run cold. Carved into its bark was an enormous version of the blue symbol, glowing so brightly it hurt to look at directly, and surrounding it were hundreds, maybe thousands of smaller symbols, each one unique and pulsing with its own rhythm. As I stared, transfixed, the symbols began to move. They flowed across the surface of the tree like living things, merging and separating in complex patterns. And with each movement, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "You're here, finally. Join us." I felt a presence behind me and spun around. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood a figure. No, not one figure. Many figures, blending and separating like the symbols on the tree. They were made of the same glowing blue energy, their forms constantly shifting and changing. What are you?" I managed to choke out. The figure S moved closer, their voice S echoing in my head rather than in the air around us. "We are the forest. We are the trail. We are the journey and the destination." They reached out a hand, or was it a branch, towards me. "And now, you are one of us." I tried to back away, but my feet wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, as if I'd become part of the forest floor. "No," I whispered. "This isn't real. It can't be real." But even as I said it, I felt something changing. The symbols from the tree were flowing down, across the ground, up my legs. They sank into my skin, glowing beneath the surface. I looked down at my hands. They were becoming translucent, filled with the same glowing blue energy. I could see the symbols moving through me, becoming part of me. "Don't fight it," the voices whispered. "Embrace it. Become one with the trail." And in that moment, I understood. Every hiker who had ever followed these trail markers, every person who had ever lost themselves in these woods, they were all here, all part of this, whatever it was. As the transformation overtook me, as my consciousness expanded to encompass the entire forest, I had one last coherent thought. I should have turned back at the first strange marker, but it was too late now. I was the forest. I was the trail. And somewhere out there, another hiker was setting off, ready to follow the blue blazes into the heart of the woods, into us, forever. Story 4. I first noticed it on a Tuesday. A slice of yellow against the darkness, a lone beacon in the night. The neighbor's window, curtains slightly parted, revealing an empty room bathed in warm light. It wasn't unusual to see lights on in the old Victorian across the street. The house had been divided into apartments years ago, and tenants came and went with the seasons. But this light was different, constant, unwavering. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe someone new had moved in, I reasoned, absent-mindedly stirring my coffee as I peered out my own window. The morning sun cast long shadows across my kitchen, and I had more pressing matters to attend to than pondering the habits of unseen neighbors. But as days turned to weeks, the light remained. Always on, always revealing that same empty room. No furniture, no people, just bare walls and hardwood floors gleaming in the artificial glow. It became a point of fascination for me, a mystery in the midst of my otherwise mundane life. I found myself gravitating towards my window more and more, coffee in hand, watching and wondering. "We're being ridiculous," I muttered to myself one evening, forcing my gaze away from the hypnotic glow across the street. "It's just a light. Probably forgot to turn it off when they moved out." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. The light wasn't constant in the way of a forgotten bulb. It had patterns, Some nights it would flicker, almost imperceptibly. Other times it would dim slightly, as if someone had adjusted a dimmer switch with exquisite precision. And then there were the shadows. I first saw them about a month after I'd noticed the light. Quick, darting things at the edge of the window. So fast I thought I'd imagined them. But as I watched, night after night, I began to see them more clearly. Shapeless at first, then slowly resolving into more distinct forms. They never fully entered the room, always staying just out of sight. But I could sense their presence, their watchfulness. It was as if the window itself was alive, observing the world outside with patient, unblinking eyes. I tried to ignore it. Tried to focus on my work, my friends, anything but the enigmatic glow from across the street. But it called to me, pulled at the edges of my consciousness, until I found myself once again at my window, staring into that empty room. It was on one of these nights, as I stood transfixed by the play of light and shadow, that I saw it. A figure, standing motionless in the center of the room. My heart leaped into my throat, a mixture of fear and excitement coursing through me. Finally, proof that I wasn't going mad. But as I stared, trying to make out details in the harsh backlight, a chill ran down my spine. The figure wasn't moving, not breathing, not shifting, just standing. And it was facing directly towards me. I stumbled back from my window, nearly dropping my mug in my haste. This was insane. I was letting my imagination run wild, seeing things that couldn't possibly be there. Get a grip, I told myself sternly, running a shaky hand through my hair. You're acting like a child afraid of the dark. But even as I tried to rationalize it, to explain away what I'd seen, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, observed, studied. The next day, I forced myself to go about my normal routine. I made my coffee, ate my breakfast, steadfastly avoiding looking out the window. But as I was getting ready to leave for work, a flash of movement caught my eye. Against my better judgment, I looked. The figure was there again, but this time, it wasn't standing still. It was mirroring my movements exactly. As I raised my hand to my face, the silhouette across the street did the same. When I took a step back, so did it. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. I fled my apartment, heart pounding. All day at work, I couldn't focus. The image of that mimicking figure played on repeat in my mind. By the time I returned home, I had convinced myself it was all a product of stress and lack of sleep. But as I approached my building, I felt it again. That prickling sensation of being watched. I looked up, almost against my will. The figure was there, waiting. And as I raised my gaze to meet its featureless face, it raised its arm in a mockery of a wave. I ran inside, slamming the door behind me. This was madness. Pure, unadulterated insanity. I needed to do something to confront this. Whatever it was, with a surge of desperate courage, I marched across the street. The old Victorian loomed over me, its windows dark and lifeless in the fading twilight. All except for that one, still glowing with its eerie, constant light. I pounded on the front door, the sound echoing in the quiet street. No answer. I tried again, louder this time. "Hello," I called out, my voice cracking slightly. "Is anyone there?" Silence. I was about to turn away when I heard it. A soft click, like a lock disengaging. The door swung open with a long, low creak. The entryway was dark, the air inside stale and musty. I hesitated on the threshold, every instinct screaming at me to run. But I had to know, had to understand. I stepped inside. The floorboards groaned under my weight as I made my way up the stairs. The wallpaper was peeling, the banister coated in a thick layer of dust. It was clear no one had lived here for years. And yet, as I reached the second floor, I could see it. That sliver of light under a closed door at the end of the hall. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. It was ice cold to the touch, sending a shiver through my entire body. With a deep breath, I turned it and pushed the door open. The room was exactly as I'd seen it from my window. Empty, bare, illuminated by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. And there, in the center of the room, stood the figure. But it wasn't a person. It wasn't anything I could comprehend. It was as if a piece of the darkness had been cut out, leaving a person-shaped hole in reality. And within that void, I saw everything. The vastness of space, the birth and death of stars, the endless cycle of creation and destruction that underpins our universe. It turned to face me, and I felt the weight of eons pressing down upon me. In that moment, I understood. This thing, this entity, had been watching me just as I had been watching it. Learning, mimicking, preparing. Who? What are you? I managed to whisper. The voice that answered didn't come from the figure, but from everywhere and nowhere at once. It resonated in my bones, in the very air around me. We are the observers, it said. We watch, we learn, we become. As it spoke, I saw its form shifting, changing, becoming more me. My features began to take shape in that void, my mannerisms, my very essence being replicated with terrifying accuracy. And now, it continued, its voice a perfect imitation of my own. We are you. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, forced to watch as this thing took on my identity, became a perfect copy of me. It stepped towards me, its movements fluid and natural. My movements. It reached out a hand, my hand, and touched my face. Thank you, it said with my voice, my inflections, for watching, for teaching us. Your role is complete now. I felt myself beginning to fade, my very being dissolving into the air around me. As the world grew dim, the last thing I saw was my own face, smiling back at me from the darkness. And then, nothing. The next morning, a figure stood at the window of the apartment across from the old Victorian. It sipped its coffee, watching the warm glow emanating from the window across the street, watching and waiting for the next observer to notice the light in the darkness. The cycle would begin again. It always did. Story 5. The first time I saw him, I didn't think much of it. Just another late-night customer at our 24-hour convenience store, bleary-eyed and fumbling for change. His hair was a mess, his clothes rumpled, and he smelled faintly of cigarettes and something I couldn't quite place. Stale sweat, maybe, or old leather. Pack of Marlboros and a large coffee, black, he mumbled, not quite meeting my eyes. I rang him up, trying not to yawn. The graveyard shift was always a slog, but hey, it paid the bills. As I handed him his change, our fingers brushed, and I had to suppress a shudder. His skin was ice cold, like he'd been standing in a freezer. Have a good night, I said, more out of habit than anything else. He grunted in response and shuffled out, the bell above the door tinkling softly in his wake. An hour later, he was back. Same messy hair, same rumpled clothes, but something was off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but a prickle of unease crawled up my spine. Pack of Marlboros and a large coffee. Black, he said, his voice oddly familiar, yet somehow different. I blinked, confused. Didn't you just... I started to say, but then shook my head. Must be the late hour playing tricks on me. Never mind. Coming right up, single quotes. As I turned to pour the coffee, I caught a glimpse of his reflection in the glass of the refrigerator door. For a split second, it looked wrong, distorted somehow. But when I whipped around to look at him directly, he was just standing there, same as before. I handed him his items, careful not to touch his hand this time. Have a good night, I said again, a bit more hesitantly. He left without a word, the bell chiming its lonely song once more. The next customer, a tired-looking woman buying diapers and energy drinks, seemed blissfully normal. I started to relax, chalking up my earlier unease to too much caffeine and too little sleep. But then, not even 30 minutes later, he was back. Pack of Marlboros and a large coffee, black, he said, and this time I was sure his voice was different. Deeper, rougher, like he'd aged years in the span of minutes. I stared at him, my heart beginning to race. His hair was grayer now, I was certain of it, and were those new wrinkles around his eyes. Sir, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, I don't mean to be rude, but haven't you been here twice already tonight? He looked at me blankly, his eyes oddly unfocused. First time, he grunted. Pack of Marlboros and a large coffee, black. I felt like I was going crazy. I knew I'd seen him before, knew it with every fiber of my being. But the security cameras had been on the fritz for weeks, so I had no way to prove it. With shaking hands, I got his items. This time, when I handed him the coffee, I deliberately let our fingers touch. His skin was hot now, burning hot, like he had a raging fever. He left, and I immediately called my manager. Hey, Lisa. Yeah, I know it's late. I'm sorry. But something weird is going on here. There's this customer who keeps coming in, but he's changing somehow. I think I might be losing it. Lisa's voice was groggy but concerned. Changing how? Jake, do you feel safe? Should I call the police? I hesitated. How could I explain it without sounding completely insane? No police. It's not. He's not threatening me or anything. It's just weird. I'll call you if anything else happens, okay? I hung up, feeling no better than before. The store suddenly felt too big, too empty. The hum of the refrigerators, usually just background noise, now seemed ominous, like the growl of some hidden beast. I busied myself restocking shelves, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. But I couldn't help glancing at the door every few seconds, waiting for the bell to chime again. And it did. Of course it did. This time, when he walked in, I had to stifle a gasp. He was older still, his hair now completely grey, his face a map of deep wrinkles. But his eyes were young, too young for that aged face. Pack of Marlboros and a large coffee, black, he rasped, his voice now like gravel in a blender. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I just stared at him, my mind reeling. He slammed his hand on the counter, making me jump. Pack of Marlboros and a large coffee, black, he repeated, more insistently this time. Wordlessly, I got his items. As I set them on the counter, I noticed his hands. They were gnarled now, the knuckles swollen, the skin mottled with liver spots. But there, on his left ring finger, was a wedding band, A wedding band I was certain hadn't been there before. He snatched up his purchases and left without paying. I didn't stop him. I couldn't have if I'd wanted to. The moment the door closed behind him, I ran to the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face. "Get it together, Jake," I muttered to my reflection. "You're just tired. This isn't real." But when I looked up, I saw him in the mirror, standing right behind me. I whirled around, my heart threatening to burst out of my chest. The bathroom was empty. Shaking, I returned to the counter. The clock on the wall read 3:47 a.m. Had time always moved this slowly? The bell chimed. I didn't want to look, didn't want to see what new horror awaited me, but I couldn't help it. He shuffled in, bent nearly double now, leaning heavily on a cane. His skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over his skull, but his eyes, God, his eyes were like a child's, bright and curious, and terribly, terribly wrong in that ancient face. "Pack of Marlboros and a large coffee," Blatty wheezed, his breath rattling in his chest. I felt something snap inside me. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shrill with fear and confusion. "What do you want from me?" He blinked those young eyes at me, his head cocking to one side like a confused puppy. "Pack of Marlboros and a large coffee, black," he repeated, as if it was the only thing he knew how to say. I backed away from the counter, bumping into the cigarette display behind me. Packs rained down around me, but I barely noticed. "Please," I whispered, "please just tell me what's happening." For a moment, just a moment, something like recognition flickered in those uncanny eyes. He opened his mouth as if to speak, and I leaned forward, desperate for any explanation. But then his face contorted in pain. He clutched at his chest, gasping for air. Before I could react, he collapsed, his frail body crumpling to the floor like a puppet with its strings cut. I vaulted over the counter, all fear forgotten in the face of this very human crisis. Sir, can you hear me?" I rolled him onto his back, ready to start CPR. But when I looked at his face, I recoiled in horror. It was melting, like a wax figure left in the sun. His features ran together, blurring and shifting. And as I watched, frozen in disbelief, his body began to shrink, growing younger before my eyes. In a matter of seconds, the old man was gone. In his place lay a middle-aged man, then a young adult, then a teenager. The reverse aging continued, faster and faster, until all that remained was a baby wailing weakly on the dirty linoleum floor. And then, in the blink of an eye, even that was gone. Nothing left but a pile of empty clothes. I scrambled backward, my mind unable to process what I'd just witnessed. This couldn't be real. It was a dream, a hallucination, anything but reality. The bell chimed. With a sense of inevitability, I turned toward the door, and there he was. Just as I'd first seen him, hair a mess, clothes rumpled, smelling of cigarettes and that undefinable something. "Pack of Marlboros and a large coffee, black," he said, not meeting my eyes. I looked at the clock. 3:47 a.m. Exactly as it had been before whatever had just happened. As if in a trance, I got his items. When I handed them over, our fingers brushed. His skin was ice cold. "Have a good night," I heard myself say, my voice sounding distant and strange to my own ears. He grunted and left. The bell chimed its familiar song. I stood there, staring at the door, knowing with a bone-deep certainty that he would be back. That this night would play out, again and again, an endless loop of aging and renewal, of life and death compressed into hours. And I would be here, watching, serving, trapped in this convenience store purgatory until what? Until I found a way to break the cycle, until I lost my mind completely. The bell chimed. He walked in, a little older now, a little grayer. Pack of Marlboros and a large coffee, black, he said. I nodded, reaching for the cigarettes with a hand that no longer shook. Coming right up, I said. The night, as always, was young. Story 6. The gentle ding of the elevator arriving on the ground floor barely registered over the bustle of the lobby. I stepped in, nodding absently to the other occupants, as I pressed the button for the 17th floor. Just another Monday morning at Pinnacle Industries. As the doors slid closed, I caught a whiff of something odd, musty, almost metallic. I wrinkled my nose, chalking it up to the building's age. The elevator was probably due for a cleaning. We ascended in silence, the soft hum of machinery the only sound. I watched the numbers tick by on the digital display above the door. 1, 2, 3. At floor 5, the elevator shuddered slightly. Nothing unusual, really. These old buildings often had their quirks. But when I glanced around, I noticed the other passengers exchanging uneasy looks. 10, 11, 12. The lighting flickered, just for a moment. In that brief instant of darkness, I could have sworn the elevator looked different, older, somehow. But when the lights stabilized, everything appeared normal. 15, 16, 17. I straightened my tie, ready to exit. But the elevator didn't stop. It kept going. 0.18, 19, 20. Excuse me, I said, turning to the woman next to me. I think we missed my floor. She didn't respond. Didn't even look at me. Her gaze was fixed straight ahead, her face a mask of indifference. 21, 22, 23. A bead of sweat trickled down my back. This wasn't right. Pinnacle Industries only had 20 floors. I jabbed at the button panel, but nothing happened. The numbers kept climbing. 25, 26, 27. The musty smell was stronger now, tinged with something I couldn't quite place. Decay, maybe. I looked around at my fellow passengers. They all stared straight ahead, unmoving, unblinking. Hey, I said, my voice rising in pitch. Something's wrong. We need to stop this elevator. No response. Not even a flicker of acknowledgement. 30, 31, 32. The elevator shuddered again, more violently this time. The lights flickered, and in that moment of darkness, I saw it again. The change. The walls were no longer sleek metal, but rough, pitted iron. The floor was grated, showing glimpses of the shaft below. When the lights came back on, everything looked normal again. But the digital display was gone, replaced by an old-fashioned analog dial. The needle quivered past 35, 36, 37. My heart was pounding now, my breath coming in short gasps. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a dream, a hallucination. I pinched myself hard, wincing at the pain. Not a dream, then. 40, 41, 42. The temperature was dropping. I could see my breath misting in front of me. The other passengers didn't seem to notice, still staring ahead with blank expressions. I turned to the man closest to me, grabbing his shoulder. Please, I begged. You have to see, this isn't normal. helped me stop it as my hand made contact. He crumbled. Not fell, not collapsed, but crumbled, like he was made of ash. In seconds, there was nothing left but a pile of grey dust on the elevator floor. I recoiled, pressing myself against the wall. The other passengers remained motionless, seemingly oblivious to their companions' disintegration. 50, 51, 52. The elevator was definitely different now. The changes were no longer fleeting glimpses in moments of darkness. The walls were a patchwork of rusted metal and some organic, pulsing material. The floor grating had widened, and through it I could see not a shaft, but an endless void. The smell was overpowering. Rot and decay and something else, something alien and wrong. It coated the back of my throat, making me gag. 60, 61, 62. I clawed at the doors, my fingers leaving trails in the rust. "Let me out!" I screamed. "Please, God, someone help me!" One of the other passengers finally moved. She turned her head towards me, so slowly it seemed to take minutes. Her face, it wasn't a face anymore, just a smooth, featureless expanse of skin. I screamed again, the sound swallowed by the ever-present hum that was growing louder, deeper, more like a growl now. 70, 71, 72. The analog dial was gone. In its place was a pulsing, fleshy mass with numbers carved into it. The needle was a shard of bone, quivering as it climbed ever higher. I sank to the floor, huddling in the corner furthest from the other passengers. They were all facing me now, their featureless heads swiveling in unison to track my movements. 80, 81, 82. The growl had become a roar. The elevator was shaking constantly now, threatening to tear itself apart. Through the grating, I could see shapes moving in the void. Vast, incomprehensible things that hurt my mind to look at. 90, 92. "Please," I whimpered, though I no longer knew who I was begging. "I want to go back. I want to go home." As if in response, the elevator jerked to a halt. The bone needle froze on 99. For a moment, everything was still, silent. Then the doors opened. What I saw beyond them, I can't describe it. I don't have the words. It was like looking at reality turned inside out, at the seething chaos that lurks beneath the skin of our orderly world. The other passengers moved as one, stepping towards the open doors. As they crossed the threshold, they changed, twisted, became part of the writhing landscape beyond. One remained behind. It turned to me, its blank face now split by a mouth filled with too many teeth. "Going up?" it asked, in a voice like grinding gravel. I pressed myself further into the corner, shaking my head violently. "No," I managed to choke out. "Down, please. I want to go down." The thing cocked its head, considering. Then, slowly, it nodded. The doors slammed shut. The bone needle began to move in reverse, spinning faster and faster. The roar became deafening. I felt my ears pop, felt a pressure building in my head like it was going to explode. I blacked out. When I came to, I was lying on the floor of a normal elevator. The walls were clean, the lighting bright and steady. The digital display above the door read G4 ground floor. The doors opened, revealing the familiar lobby of Pinnacle Industries. People streamed in and out, caught up in the Monday morning rush. On shaky legs, I stumbled out of the elevator. A woman in a smart business suit gave me an odd look as she entered, but said nothing. The doors closed behind her, and the elevator ascended normally. I made my way to a bench in the lobby, collapsing onto it. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had it all been some sort of waking nightmare? A stress-induced hallucination? As my racing heart began to slow, I almost convinced myself that's all it had been. Just a bizarre daydream brought on by too much coffee and too little sleep. Then I noticed something on my hand, a smear of rust, and caught in it a single grey ash, like all that remained of a person turned to dust. I looked up at the bank of elevators, watching as they ferried people up and down. Normal, ordinary, safe. But I knew the truth now. Knew what lurked beyond the highest floors, in the spaces between reality. And I knew that someday, somehow, it would call me back. I stood up on wobbly legs and made my way out of the building. I'd take the stairs from now on, no matter how many floors, because the alternative was unthinkable. As I pushed through the revolving doors, I heard a faint sound from behind me, the soft, innocuous ding of an arriving elevator. I didn't look back. Story 7. The key stuck in the lock, requiring a bit of jiggling before the door. Finally swung open with a creak that seemed to echo through the empty house. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight, and fumbled for a light switch. "Hello?" I called out, more out of habit than any real expectation of a response. The Airbnb listing had promised a quaint, secluded cottage, and it was certainly delivering on the secluded part. The lights flickered to life, revealing a cozy living room straight out of a vintage catalogue. Floral wallpaper, doilies on every surface, and furniture that looked like it had been around since before I was born. It was charming, in an old lady who collects porcelain cats kind of way. I dropped my bags by the door and started exploring. Kitchen, check. Bathroom, check. Bedroom. There it was, tucked away at the back of the house. I pushed open the door and froze. The room was dominated by an enormous, ornate mirror. It stretched nearly from floor to ceiling, its gilded frame intricate with carved vines and flowers. It was beautiful, no doubt, but something about it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Get a grip, Sarah," I muttered to myself. "It's just a mirror." I approached it cautiously, taking in my reflection. Same old me. Tired eyes, messy hair, the remnants of airplane grime still clinging to my skin. I needed a shower and about 12 hours of sleep. As I turned away, something caught my eye. For a split second, it looked like my reflection had moved a fraction of a second after I did. I whipped back around, staring hard at the mirror. Nothing seemed amiss now. Jet lag, I decided. You're seeing things. After a quick shower and an even quicker meal of granola bars from my bag, grocery shopping would have to wait until tomorrow. I fell into bed. As I drifted off to sleep, I could have sworn I saw movement in the mirror out of the corner of my eye. But by the time I roused myself enough to look, there was nothing there but my own sleepy face staring back at me. I woke to sunlight streaming through gauzy curtains and the chirping of birds outside. For a moment, I forgot where I was, the unfamiliar room disorienting me. Then it all came flooding back. The red-eye flight, the long drive, the creepy mirror. I sat up, looking at said mirror with fresh eyes. In the warm light of day, it didn't seem nearly as ominous. Just a lovely antique, probably worth a small fortune. I got up, stretching, and walked over to get a better look. My reflection did the same, mirroring my movements exactly. I smiled, feeling a bit foolish about my late-night imaginings. Then I saw it. As I lowered my arms, my reflection's right hand stayed up for just a fraction of a second longer than it should have. I froze, staring intently at the mirror. Everything looked normal now, but I was sure of what I'd seen. "Hello," I said, feeling ridiculous, even as the word left my mouth. Is someone there?" Silence. Just my own confused face looking back at me. I shook my head, trying to clear it. "Coffee," I muttered. "I need coffee." The day passed uneventfully. I explored the small town nearby, picked up some groceries, and tried to put the mirror out of my mind. But as evening fell and I returned to the cottage, I found my steps slowing as I approached the bedroom. "Don't be stupid," I chided myself. "It's an inanimate object. It can't hurt you." But as I pushed open the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. The room looked the same, the mirror unchanged. Yet there was a heaviness in the air, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I walked up to the mirror, determined to face my fears head-on. My reflection stared back at me, mimicking my movements perfectly. I raised my hand, watching as the mirror me did the same. I waved. She waved back. Then I lowered my hand, and my blood ran cold. The reflection's hand stayed up, waving on its own for several seconds before slowly lowering. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. "This isn't real," I whispered. "This can't be happening." But it was. As I watched, rooted to the spot in horror, my reflection began to move independently. It cocked its head, studying me with my own eyes. A smile spread across its face, but it wasn't my smile. It was too wide, too knowing. I ran, out of the bedroom, through the house, not stopping until I was outside in the cool night air. I gulped in deep breaths, trying to slow my racing heart. "Okay, Sarah, think," I said aloud. "There has to be a logical explanation. Maybe it's some kind of high-tech prank mirror, or a hallucination from something in the house. Carbon monoxide." None of the explanations felt right, but they were better than accepting the impossible alternative. I spent the night on the lumpy living room couch, unable to bring myself to go back into the bedroom. When morning came, I steeled myself to pack my things and leave. I couldn't stay here, not with whatever that was in the mirror. But as I entered the bedroom, sunlight streaming through the windows, everything seemed normal. My reflection behaved exactly as it should, mirroring my movements precisely. I laughed, shakily. "Get it together, girl. You're letting your imagination run wild." I started packing, occasionally glancing at the mirror. Nothing unusual happened. By the time I was done, I'd almost convinced myself that I'd dreamed or hallucinated the whole thing. Almost, as I zipped up my suitcase. I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned slowly, dread pooling in my stomach. My reflection was sitting on the bed. I was standing. "No," I breathed. "No, this isn't real." The reflection, the thing that looked like me, but wasn't, stood up. It walked towards the mirror, its movements fluid but somehow wrong, like a marionette with loose strings. It pressed its hand against the glass from the inside, and smiled. I watched, paralyzed with fear, as ripples spread out from its hand. The surface of the mirror undulated like water, and then, impossibly, horrifyingly, a hand emerged. My hand, but not mine. I finally found my voice and screamed, The sound seemed to energize the thing in the mirror. It pushed harder, its arm coming through up to the elbow now. I grabbed my suitcase and ran, slamming the bedroom door behind me. I didn't stop running until I was in my car, tires squealing as I peeled out of the driveway. As I drove, hands shaking on the steering wheel, I tried to make sense of what had happened. It was impossible. People don't climb out of mirrors. Reflections don't move on their own. I must be having some kind of breakdown. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real. I drove for hours, putting as much distance between myself and that house as I could. When exhaustion finally forced me to stop at a motel, I avoided looking at any reflective surfaces as I checked in. In the bathroom, I covered the mirror with a towel, before quickly washing my face. As I pulled the towel down, I caught a glimpse of my reflection. It winked at me. I haven't looked in a mirror since that day. I've learned to navigate life without them, but it's not easy. People think I'm eccentric at best, mentally ill at worst. Maybe they're right. But sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I see movement in windows, in puddles, in any reflective surface, and I know it's still out there, waiting, watching. My reflection, but not me. And one day, I fear it will find a way to switch our places for good. So if you're ever in an Airbnb or any place with an antique mirror, pay attention to your reflection. And if it moves just a little too slowly, or smiles just a little too widely, run. Run and don't look back, because you never know what might be looking back at you. Story 8. The screech of metal on metal pierced through my music as the subway train pulled into the station. I yanked out my earbuds, wincing at the assault on my ears. Just another Monday morning in the city. I shuffled forward with the crowd, squeezing into the already packed car. The doors slid shut with a hiss, and we lurched into motion. I grabbed a handrail, my fingers slipping slightly on the grimy metal. The smell of stale sweat and cheap cologne hung heavy in the air. As the initial jostling settled, I glanced around at my fellow commuters. The usual mix of sleepy office workers, students with oversized backpacks, and the occasional tourist looking lost and overwhelmed. Nothing out of the ordinary, or so I thought. It was the man directly across from me who first caught my attention. Mid-40s, unremarkable suit, thinning hair. But something about him seemed off. It took me a moment to realize what it was. He wasn't moving at all. Not the slight sway that comes with the motion of the train, not the occasional blink, not even the rise and fall of breath. I blinked hard, sure I must be seeing things. When I looked again, he was exactly the same, completely, unnaturally still. A chill ran down my spine. I looked around at the other passengers, trying to catch someone's eye, to see if anyone else had noticed. But no one was looking up. They were all staring straight ahead or down at their phones. That's when I realized. They weren't moving either. The woman next to me, her hand frozen in the act of tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. The teenager a few feet away, his mouth open mid-yawn. Even a drop of condensation on the window seemed suspended in time, refusing to succumb to gravity. My heart began to race. What was happening? Was I dreaming? Having some kind of stroke that was messing with my perception? I pinched myself hard, wincing at the sharp pain. Definitely awake. "Hello," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. No one responded. No one even twitched. The train slowed as we approached the next station. I held my breath, waiting to see what would happen. The doors opened with their usual electronic chime, For a moment, nothing changed. Then, as one, the people on the platform began to move. They flowed into the car like water, filling every available space. But as soon as they crossed the threshold, they too became still, frozen in mid-step, mid-gesture. I pressed myself against the door, trying to make room, trying not to touch any of these unsettling statues. But it was impossible in the crowded car. My shoulder brushed against a man's arm, and I recoiled. His skin was ice cold. The doors closed. We moved on. I fumbled for my phone with shaking hands, desperate to call for help, to prove to myself that the outside world still existed. But the screen remained black, unresponsive. Dead, or maybe frozen in time like everything else. At the next stop, it happened again. More people entered, instantly becoming motionless. The car was getting impossibly full now. Body pressed against unmoving body. I could barely breathe, surrounded by this silent, unbreathing crowd. I lost track of how many stops we passed. Each time, more people entered, never leaving, just endlessly filling the car. I was pushed further and further back, hemmed in on all sides by cold, unmoving flesh. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Tried to push my way through the crowd, but it was like trying to move statues. Panic clawed at my throat, threatening to overwhelm me. That's when I saw her. A little girl, no more than 7 or 8, standing near the doors. Unlike everyone else, she was moving. Her head swiveled slowly, taking in the scene with wide, solemn eyes. Our gazes met. She smiled, but it wasn't a child's smile. It was ancient, knowing. Wrong. What's happening? I managed to choke out. Her voice, when she spoke, was like dry leaves rustling. You're seeing the truth now, seeing what's always been here. I don't understand, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She cocked her head, studying me like I was a particularly interesting insect. They're not real, she said, gesturing at the frozen passengers. None of this is real. It's all just filler. Background, NPCs, in the great game of your life. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of her words. But I know some of these people. I see them every day on my commute. The girl's smile widened, showing too many teeth. Do you? Do you really know them? Or do you just see the same empty shells, day after day, going through the motions of life without ever truly living? I shook my head, unwilling or unable to accept what she was saying. No, that's not. People are real. They have lives, families, dreams. Some do, she conceded. The main characters, like you. But the rest... She waved her hand, and the frozen passengers began to flicker like bad holograms. For a moment, I saw through them, saw the empty train car beyond. Then they solidified again, but now they all had the same face. My face. I screamed then, the sound tearing from my throat and echoing in the suddenly vast space of the car. The girl watched me impassively, unperturbed by my terror. Why? I gasped when I could speak again. Why show me this? She shrugged, a too adult gesture on her small frame. Why not? Sometimes the illusion slips. Sometimes people see behind the curtain. It doesn't change anything in the long run. The train began to slow again, approaching another station. The girl turned towards the doors. This is my stop, she said. You should get off too, or don't. It doesn't really matter. The doors slid open. Beyond them was not a subway platform, but a swirling vortex of colors and shapes that hurt my eyes to look at. The girl stepped forward, pausing at the threshold. She looked back at me one last time. "Remember," she said, "none of this is real. But that doesn't mean it can't hurt you." And then she was gone, swallowed up by the impossible space beyond the doors. I stood there, paralyzed with indecision. Part of me wanted to follow her, to escape this nightmare. But another part, the part still clinging to sanity, to the world I thought I knew, kept me rooted to the spot. The doors began to close. At the last second, I made my choice. I lunged forward, squeezing through just before they slammed shut. I found myself on a normal subway platform, surrounded by normal, moving people. The train pulled away, carrying its cargo of frozen passengers to who knows where. I stumbled to a bench and sat heavily, my mind struggling to process what had happened. Had any of it been real? Was I going insane? A man sat down next to me, too close for comfort. I turned to ask him to move over and froze. It was my face staring back at me, attached to a body in a suit I didn't own. "Rough commute?" it asked in my voice. I ran. Out of the station, up to the street, not stopping until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out. When I finally slowed, I found myself in a part of the city I didn't recognize. The buildings looked wrong, their proportions subtly off. The people walking by all had a slightly blurred quality, like they were out of focus. And every reflexive surface, every window, every puddle, showed me a face that wasn't quite my own. I don't take the subway anymore. I don't go out much at all, if I can help it, because now I know the truth. The world isn't what we think it is. Reality is thin, fragile, and sometimes, if you look too closely, you can see right through it. So I keep my eyes down. I don't engage. I try to convince myself that what I saw that day was a hallucination, a dream, anything but the truth. But sometimes, late at night, I hear a little girl's laughter. And I know, none of this is real. But that doesn't mean it can't hurt me. Story 9. The incessant buzzing of my phone dragged me from a fitful sleep. I fumbled for it in the dark, squinting at the too-bright screen. 3:47 a.m. Great! A notification blinked at me. One new voicemail. Weird. I hadn't heard it ring. Probably just another spam call. I was about to ignore it when I noticed the date. June 15th, 2022. Over a year ago. Fully awake now, I sat up, a chill running down my spine despite the warm summer night. How had I missed a voicemail for over a year? And why was I just getting notified now? Curiosity overrode my unease. I tapped the notification, put the phone to my ear, and listened. Static crackled, then cleared, and I heard my own voice. "Listen carefully," my voice said, tight with fear. "I don't have much time. Whatever you do, don't." The message cut off abruptly. I stared at my phone, my heart pounding. What the hell was that? It was definitely my voice, but I had no memory of leaving myself a voicemail. Especially not one that sounded so desperate. I played it again and again. Each time, that same frantic message cut short before I could warn myself about what? Sleep was out of the question now. I paced my small apartment, the phone clutched in my hand like a lifeline. Theories raced through my mind, each more outlandish than the last. A prank, some elaborate hack, a glitch in the phone system that somehow mixed up someone else's message with my voice. Or was I losing my mind? As the first rays of dawn crept through my blinds, I made a decision. I'd go about my day as normal. Surely in the light of day, this would all seem less ominous. Just a weird tech hiccup, nothing more. I showered, dressed, and headed to work, determinedly pushing the voicemail out of my mind. The morning passed in a blur of meetings and emails. By lunch, I'd almost convinced myself I'd dreamed the whole thing. Then my phone buzzed. Another voicemail notification. My hands shook as I listened to the message. "It's happening again," my voice said, somehow sounding even more panicked than before. "You have to stop it. Remember the cabin? Remember what happened there? Don't let static." Then silence. I barely made it to the bathroom before I threw up, my mind reeling. The cabin? What cabin? I hadn't been to a cabin in years, not since that ill-fated camping trip in college, where a flash of memory hit me like a physical blow. Dark woods, a ramshackle cabin, the smell of pine and something else, something wrong. I gripped the edges of the sink, staring at my pale reflection. What was happening to me? I called in sick for the rest of the day and went home, my mind churning. I needed answers. I dug through old photos, emails, anything that might jog my memory about a cabin, but there was nothing. As night fell, I found myself jumping at every sound, checking my phone obsessively. Would there be another message? Did I even want there to be? At precisely 3:47 a.m., my phone buzzed. "Listen to me," my voice pleaded. "It's not what you think. They're lying to you. All of it. Your job, your friends, this life. It's not real. You have to wake up. Find the cabin. It's the only way to." The message ended in a scream that made my blood run cold. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. The messages kept coming, always at 3:47 a.m., always in my voice, always cut off before I could understand what I was trying to tell myself. The symbols are the key. Look for the symbols. Don't trust anyone, especially not it's closer than you think. It's by the 5th day I was a wreck. I'd stopped going to work, stopped answering calls from concerned friends. My apartment was a mess of scribbled notes and half-formed theories. The walls seemed to close in on me, every shadow hiding some nameless threat. And always, that nagging feeling that I was forgetting something crucial, something about a cabin. On the 7th day, I cracked. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to find answers, had to understand what these messages meant. I packed a bag, got in my car, and just drove. I had no destination in mind, no plan. Just a desperate need to do something, anything, to shake this feeling of impending doom. Hours passed. The city gave way to suburbs, then to rolling countryside. As night fell, I found myself on a lonely mountain road, trees looming on either side. It felt familiar, and then I saw it. A dirt road, barely visible in the gloom. Without conscious thought, I turned onto it. The road wound through dense forest, branches scraping against my car. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I pressed on. I had to know. Finally, the trees opened up into a small clearing, and there it was, the cabin. Dilapidated, half reclaimed by nature. It squatted in the moonlight like some malevolent beast. This was it. The place from my fractured memories. The place my messages had been trying to warn me about, or lead me to. I got out of the car on shaky legs, the silence of the forest pressing in around me. The smell hit me immediately. Pine, yes, but underneath it, something sickly sweet. The smell of decay. As I approached the cabin, I saw them. The symbols, carved into the wood of the door, painted on the windows. Spirals and angles that hurt my eyes to look at directly. My phone buzzed in my pocket. 3:47 a.m. With trembling fingers, I answered. "You're here," my voice said, clearer than ever before. "Good. Now remember. Remember everything." The world shifted. Reality seemed to bend and warp around me, and suddenly I did remember. This wasn't the first time I'd been here. This wasn't even the first time I'd received those messages. I had been caught in a loop, reliving the same series of events over and over, each time forgetting, each time being led back here. To this cabin. To the thing that waited inside. Because there was something inside. Something old. Something hungry. Something that fed not on flesh, but on fear. On the terror of realization. On the horror of remembered trauma. And I had been its meal for how long? Years? Decades? Centuries? The door of the cabin creaked open. Darkness beckoned. I knew what would happen if I went inside. I would face the nameless horror within. I would scream. I would be consumed. My essence fed into the cycle once more. And then I would wake up, a year ago, with no memory of what had happened. The messages would start again. The cycle would continue. But what if I didn't go in? What if I broke the cycle? I stood there, trembling, caught between the unthinkable horror ahead and the unknown consequences of defiance. My phone buzzed one last time. I looked down at the screen, expecting another message. Instead, I saw my own face looking back at me, but not me as I am now. This was an older version of me, eyes sunken, face gaunt with endless terror. "Choose," it said simply. I looked back at the open door, at the symbols that seemed to writhe and pulse in the moonlight, at the darkness that waited to embrace me once more. I made my choice. I turned away, got in my car, drove away from that accursed place as fast as I could. I'd like to say that was the end of it, that I broke free, that the cycle was broken. But the truth is, I don't know. Even now, months later, I'm not sure if I'm truly free or if this is just a new variation of the loop. A crueler one, perhaps, that lets me think I've escaped, only to draw me back in when I least expect it. Sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wonder if I'm still in that cabin, if all of this is just another layer of the horror's feeding cycle. And every night at 3:47 a.m., I wait for a buzzing phone, for a message from myself, for the moment when I'll have to choose again, because deep down, I know the truth. You can't escape your own fears. You can only hope to face them, again and again and again. Story 10. The steady beep of the heart monitor was the first thing I heard as consciousness slowly returned. My eyelids felt like lead weights as I struggled to open them. The harsh fluorescent light stabbing at my retinas when I finally succeeded. "Where?" My voice came out as a rasp, my throat dry and scratchy. "Oh, you're awake." A cheerful voice chirped from somewhere to my left. A nurse in pale blue scrubs appeared in my field of vision, her smile just a bit too wide to be comforting. "How are you feeling, Mr. Thompson?" I blinked, trying to focus. Confused, I managed to croak out. "What happened? Why am I here?" The nurse's smile never wavered. "You were in an accident, Mr. Thompson. But don't worry, you're safe now. You're at St. Mary's Hospital. I'll let the doctor know you're awake. She bustled out of the room before I could ask any more questions, leaving me alone with my growing unease. An accident. I struggled to remember, but my mind was a blank slate. The last thing I could recall was, going to work, having dinner. Everything was a haze. I tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness forced me back down. As I lay there, I began to notice little details about the room. The walls were an off-white color, but there was something odd about the texture. It seemed to shift slightly when I wasn't looking directly at it. And the ceiling tiles, weren't there supposed to be holes in those? Before I could ponder these inconsistencies further, the door opened and a doctor strode in. He was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed just a bit too long for his body. His white coat was immaculate, not a wrinkle in sight. "Mr. Temedson," he said, his voice smooth and modulated. "I'm Dr. Erickson. How are we feeling?" "Confused," I repeated. "I can't remember what happened." The nurse mentioned an accident. Dr. Erickson nodded, making a note on his clipboard. "Yes, a rather nasty car crash. You've been unconscious for 3 days. Some memory loss is to be expected, but it should return in time. 3 days? That didn't feel right." "My family," I said suddenly. "Have they been notified? My wife must be worried sick." A flicker of something passed over the doctor's face. Concern, amusement. It was gone so quickly, I couldn't be sure I'd seen it at all. "Of course," he said smoothly. "They've been informed. Now, let's check your vitals, shall we?" As he went through the motions of examining me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. His hands were cold, impossibly cold, and his movements seemed almost mechanical. "Everything looks good," he announced finally. "We'll keep you for observation for another day or two, just to be safe. Try to get some rest, Mr. Thompson." As he turned to leave, I called out, "Wait, when can I see my family?" "Doctor," Erickson paused at the door. "Soon," he said, without turning around. Very soon, the days that followed were a blur of tests, examinations, and growing unease. Every time I asked about my family, I was given vague assurances that they'd be there soon. The staff was unfailingly polite, but there was an artificial quality to their friendliness that set my teeth on edge, and the inconsistencies kept piling up. The view from my window never seemed to change. The same cloudy sky day after day. The food, while edible, had no taste. And sometimes, when the room was quiet, I could swear I heard whispers coming from the walls. On the 3rd day, or was it the 4th, time seemed to blur together. I decided I'd had enough. I was feeling stronger, and the fog in my mind had started to clear. I needed answers. I waited until the night shift changed over, then carefully disconnected myself from the various monitors. The floor was cold under my bare feet as I crept to the door and peered out into the hallway. It was deserted, stretching out in both directions farther than seemed possible for a hospital corridor. The fluorescent lights flickered ominously, creating moving shadows that seemed to reach out towards me. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out of my room. The whispers I'd heard before grew louder, a susurrus of unintelligible words that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I picked a direction at random and started walking. The hallway seemed to go on forever, doors lining both sides at irregular intervals. I tried a few, but they were all locked. Just as I was about to give up and turn back, I saw a door at the end of the hall marked records. It was ajar, a sliver of light spilling out into the corridor. Heart pounding, I approached and pushed it open. The room beyond was filled with filing cabinets, stretching up to a ceiling that seemed impossibly high. In the center of the room was a desk, and seated at it was me. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. The other me looked up, a sad smile on his, my face. "I was wondering when you'd find your way here," he said in my voice. What is this?" I managed to choke out. "Who are you?" I sighed. "I'm you. Or rather, I'm the you that remembers. The you that knows the truth." "What truth?" I demanded, my voice rising. "What's going on here?" The other me stood up, his movements mirroring my own nervous gestures. "This isn't a hospital, Alex. It never was. This is, well, I suppose you could call it a waiting room. A place between places." I shook my head, refusing to accept what I was hearing. No. This is some kind of trick. Or I'm hallucinating. "The accident. There was no accident." He cut me off gently. "Think, Alex. Really think. What's the last thing you remember before waking up here?" I closed my eyes, forcing myself to concentrate. And suddenly, it all came flooding back. The argument with Sarah, the bottle of pills, the decision that I thought would end it all. My eyes snapped open, filled with tears. I killed myself," I whispered. The other me nodded solemnly. "Yes and no, you tried. But something intervened, and now you're here. In this place where souls like ours wait to be judged, to be sorted." "Sorted," I echoed, my mind struggling to comprehend. "Sorted how? And why can't I remember any of this most of the time?" He smiled sadly. "Because remembering is painful. It's easier to believe the lie, to think you're just in a hospital recovering from an accident. As for the sorting," he gestured around at the filing cabinets. "Every drawer represents a possible fate. Rebirth, oblivion, paradise, torment, and everything in between. We're here to decide which drawer opens for us." I staggered back, overwhelmed. "This can't be real. It can't be." "I'm afraid it is," he said. "And you have a choice to make. You can go back to your room, forget this conversation, and continue in blissful ignorance until a decision is made for you. Or you can stay here. Confront the truth of what you've done and what comes next." I looked back at the door, tempted by the easy way out. But something made me turn back. "What? What do you think I should do?" The other me, the real me, smiled. "I think you already know the answer to that. We've spent too long running from the hard truths. It's time to face them." With shaking hands, I pulled up a chair and sat down across from myself. "Okay," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me everything." As my other self began to speak, the whispers from the walls grew louder, more insistent. But for the first time since I'd woken up in this place, I wasn't afraid. Whatever came next, whatever drawer ultimately opened for me, I would face it with open eyes and a clear conscience. The truth, I realized, was the first step towards whatever redemption might be possible for a soul like mine. Story 11. I first noticed them on moving day. A cluster of faces peering out from behind lacy curtains, their eyes following my every move as I lugged boxes from the U-Haul to my new front door. I waved, trying to be friendly, but they just stared, unblinking, unwavering. "Don't mind the neighbors," the previous owner had said when I bought the place. They're just protective of the neighborhood. He'd chuckled, but there was an edge to it that I couldn't quite place. I shrugged it off. Every neighborhood had its quirks, right? And after the year I'd had, the messy divorce, the job loss, the desperate need for a fresh start, I was willing to overlook a few odd neighbors, if it meant I could afford a house in a safe area. But as days turned into weeks, the staring didn't stop. Every time I left for a job interview or came back with groceries, there they were, watching, sometimes from windows, sometimes from portières or carefully manicured lawns. Always silent, always watching. It was a month in when someone finally spoke to me. I was checking the mail when a woman approached, her smile too wide, her eyes never quite meeting mine. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said, her voice syrupy sweet. "I'm Margaret, head of the neighborhood watch." "Oh, thanks," I replied, taken aback by the sudden interaction. "I'm Jack. Nice to meet you. We're so glad you've joined our little community," Margaret continued, still smiling that unsettling smile. "We take security very seriously here. You'll see us around quite a bit. Just keeping an eye out. For everyone's safety, of course." Before I could respond, she turned and walked away, her movements stiff and unnatural. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside had me on edge. I kept thinking I saw shadows moving past my windows, heard whispers just on the edge of hearing. In the morning, bleary-eyed and jittery from too much coffee, I found a flyer in my mailbox. Neighborhood watch meeting. Tonight, attendance mandatory. The last word was underlined 3 times. I considered skipping it, claiming I was sick or had a prior engagement. But something told me that wouldn't fly with Margaret and her crew. The meeting was held in a community center that looked like it hadn't been updated since the IRE, 1970s. Faded streamers and ancient motivational posters adorned wood-paneled walls. The smell of stale coffee and something else, something metallic and vaguely unpleasant, hung in the air. Every seat was filled when I arrived, all eyes turning to me as I entered. The silence was deafening. I took the only empty chair, acutely aware of the eyes boring into me from all sides. Margaret stood at the front, that same wide smile plastered on her face. "Welcome, everyone. And a special welcome to our newest member, Jack." A murmur ran through the crowd. It sounded less like words and more like the buzzing of insects. "As you all know," Margaret continued, "our community's safety is our top priority. We must all do our part. Watch, report, protect." The crowd repeated the words in unison. Watch, report, protect. Their voices were flat, emotionless. Margaret's gaze locked onto me. "Jack, are you ready to do your part?" All eyes were on me, waiting, expectant. I felt a bead of sweat trickle down my back. Yes, I said, hating how unsure I sounded. Margaret's smile widened and possibly further. "Excellent. You'll start tonight. Midnight, shift. Don't be late." The meeting ended abruptly after that. As people filed out, no one spoke. No one looked at each other. They moved like automatons, with jerky, unnatural movements. I lingered, hoping to ask Margaret what exactly the midnight shift entailed. But when I turned to where she had been standing, she was gone. In her place was a single sheet of paper. Rules for watch duty, the heading read, "Always be watching. Report any and all unusual activity. Never intervene directly." Do not speak to or acknowledge those being watched. If you see it, do not run. Do not scream. Just keep watching. The last rule sent a chill down my spine. What was it? And why did it warrant its own special rule? That night, at precisely midnight, I took up my post on my front porch. The street was eerily quiet, not even the usual sounds of nighttime wildlife breaking the silence. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized I wasn't alone. On every porch, in every window, stood a figure, motionless, watching. Just like I was supposed to be doing. Hours crawled by. My back ached, my eyes strained in the darkness. But I didn't dare move, didn't dare break the unnatural stillness that had descended on the neighborhood. It was nearing 3 a.m. when I saw it. A flicker of movement in the shadows between houses. Something that seemed to shift and change as it moved, never quite settling on a single form. My heart raced. Was this the it the rules had mentioned? I wanted to run, to hide, to do anything but stand there and watch. But the rules echoed in my mind. If you see it, do not run. Do not scream. Just keep watching. So I watched. I watched as it slithered from shadow to shadow, getting closer to my house with each passing moment. I watched as it paused at the edge of my lawn, a writhing mass of darkness that hurt my eyes to look at directly. And then, to my horror, it turned towards me. I couldn't see eyes in that roiling darkness, but I felt its gaze lock onto me, felt it recognize me as something new, something different. It surged forward, crossing my lawn in the blink of an eye. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but stand there. But I was frozen, paralyzed by fear and the inexorable command to keep watching. It reached the edge of my porch. Tendrils of darkness reached out, brushing against my shoes. I could feel the cold emanating from it, a bone-deep chill that seemed to suck the very life from the air around it. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone, retreating back into the shadows between houses, leaving nothing but the lingering cold and the thundering of my heart to prove it had ever been there. As the sun began to rise, the other watchers retreated into their homes. I stumbled inside, collapsing onto my couch, my mind reeling from what I'd seen. There was a knock at my door. Margaret stood there, her smile as wide and unsettling as ever. "Congratulations," she said. "You've passed your first night. You're one of us now." "What? What was that thing?" I managed to ask. Her smile faltered for just a moment. "That's why we watch," she said. "That's why we're always watching. It's been here longer than us. It'll be here after us. All we can do is watch, and make sure it doesn't take any of us." "Take us where?" I asked, dreading the answer. Margaret's eyes went distant. "We don't know. Those it takes. They're just gone. Empty houses. Empty lives. Like they never existed at all." She turned to leave, then paused. "Remember, Jack, always be watching. It's the only way to stay safe." As she walked away, I closed the door and sank to the floor. I wanted to run, to pack up and leave this nightmare behind, but I knew, deep down, that it was too late. I was part of this now, part of the watch. I glanced out my window. In every house, in every window, eyes stared back, always watching, always vigilant, and somewhere in the shadows, it waited, patient, hungry. I took up my post by the window, and I watched. Because in this neighborhood, if you're not watching, you might just disappear. Story 12. The first drop of rain hit my windshield like a harbinger of doom. Within seconds, it was joined by a torrent of its siblings, turning the night into a watery hell. I leaned forward, squinting through the glass, desperately trying to make out the road ahead. That's when I heard it. A sputtering cough from under the hood, followed by an ominous whine. The dashboard lit up like a Christmas tree, warning lights flashing their silent alerts. No, 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 I muttered, easing my foot off the gas. Not now. Please, not now. But my pleas fell on deaf ears. The car shuddered once, twice, and then went silent, coasting to a stop on the shoulder of the lonely highway. I sat there for a moment, listening to the rain hammer against the roof, trying to slow my racing heart. I was miles from anywhere, on a stretch of road that hadn't seen a gas station or house for at least an hour. My phone, predictably, showed no signal. Of course, why make this easy? Popping the hood, I stepped out into the deluge. The rain was ice cold, soaking me to the bone in seconds. I peered at the engine, but in the darkness and rain, it was a hopeless task. I couldn't even tell what was water and what might be leaking fluid. A flash of light in my peripheral vision made me turn. Headlights, approaching from the direction I'd come. My heart leaped. Maybe this night wouldn't be a total disaster after all. I waved my arms frantically, praying the driver would see me through the rain. The car, an old model sedan, I noticed as it got closer, slowed and pulled up behind me. Relief flooded through me as the driver's door opened. A man stepped out, surprisingly dry despite the downpour. He was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed just a bit too long for his body. His face was hidden in the shadow of an old-fashioned flat cap. "Car trouble?" he asked, his voice oddly muffled by the rain. I nodded, gesturing helplessly at my steaming hood. "Yeah, it just died on me. I don't suppose you know anything about engines." The man chuckled, a sound that sent an inexplicable chill down my spine. "Oh, I know a thing or two. Let's take a look, shall we?" He moved to the front of my car with an easy grace that belied his gangly frame. As he leaned over the engine, I caught a glimpse of his face in the glow of the headlights. His skin was pale, almost translucent, with eyes that seemed too large, too dark. I shook my head, blaming the trick of light on the rain and my frayed nerves. "I really appreciate this," I said, raising my voice to be heard over the storm. I was starting to think I'd be stuck out here all night. The man didn't respond, his long fingers moving over the engine with a familiarity that was both reassuring and unsettling. After a few moments, he straightened up. "Looks like your timing belt's gone," he said. "Nasty business. You won't be driving this anywhere tonight." My heart sank. Damn, I don't suppose you could give me a ride to the nearest town. "I can call a tow from there." The man tilted his head, considering. "I could," he said slowly, "but I think I have a better idea. I've got some tools in my car. I might be able to rig something up to get you going, at least for a little while." Relief washed over me. "Really, that would be amazing. Thank you so much, Mr. Smith," he said. John Smith. Even through my gratitude, a small part of my brain registered how generic that name sounded. But I was too cold, too wet, too desperate to get moving again, to dwell on it. Mr. Smith went back to his car, returning with a battered toolbox. As he set to work on my engine, I noticed something odd. Despite the pouring rain, The tools came out of the box, completely dry. And Mr. Smith himself. I realized with a start that he wasn't wet at all. Not a drop of rain clung to his clothes or skin. A chill that had nothing to do with the weather ran through me. I took a step back, suddenly wary. Mr. Smith? How are you? He looked up, those two large eyes locking onto mine. How am I, what? He asked, his voice taking on an edge I hadn't noticed before. Before I could respond, the sound of another engine cut through the rain. Headlights appeared in the distance, growing brighter as they approached. Mr. Smith's head snapped around, his movements unnaturally quick. "Ah," he said, his voice now tinged with, "Was that anticipation? Right on time." "On time for what?" I asked, my unease growing by the second. "Mr. Smith, what's going on?" He turned back to me, a smile spreading across his face. It was too wide, revealing too many teeth. "Why, the gathering, of course. We've been waiting for you, you know. The final piece." The approaching car pulled up behind Mr. Smith's sedan. As the driver stepped out, my blood ran cold. It was another Mr. Smith. Same height, same clothes, same unsettling smile. I backed away, my heart pounding. What is this? Who are you people? More cars were appearing now, materializing out of the rain-soaked darkness. Each one identical to the last, each one disgorging another Mr. Smith onto the roadside. The original Mr. Smith. Or was he? They all looked the same now. Stepped towards me, his movements fluid and predatory. "We are the helpers," he said, his voice now a chorus as the others joined in. "We assist those in need, those who are lost, those who are alone." I turned to run, but found my path blocked by more Mr. Smiths. They formed a circle around me, their identical faces all wearing that same terrible smile. "Please," I begged, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't understand. What do you want from me?" The Emma Smiths spoke as one, their voices blending into a sound that was both beautiful and terrifying. "We want you to join us, to become one of us, to help others as we have helped you." One of them reached out, his two long fingers brushing against my cheek. His touch was ice cold, sending shivers through my entire body. "Don't be afraid," he said. "It's a gift, really, to be part of something greater, to never be alone again." I wanted to scream, to fight, to do anything but stand there trembling. But my body wouldn't respond. I felt a numbness spreading from where the Mr. Smith had touched me, creeping through my veins like ice water. "Why me?" I managed to ask, my voice sounding distant and strange to my own ears. The Mr. Smiths smiled in unison. "Because you needed help," they said. "Because you were alone on a dark road. Because you were perfect." The numbness had reached my chest now. I could feel my heartbeat slowing, my thoughts becoming sluggish. The rain, which had been so cold before, now felt warm against my skin. "What's happening to me?" I whispered. "You're becoming the Mr. Smiths answered. "Becoming one of us, a helper, a Smith." I looked down at my hands. In the glow of the headlights, I could see my skin becoming pale, translucent. My fingers seemed longer, more elegant, more like theirs. A part of me wanted to resist, to fight against this impossible transformation. But a larger part, a growing part, felt a sense of peace, of belonging, of purpose. The circle of Mr. Smiths opened, revealing a new car. My car, but not as it had been. It was now identical to all the others. Clean, pristine, waiting as one. The Mr. Smiths spoke again. It's time to take your place. Time to help the next lost soul. I nodded, understanding filling me. I knew my role now, knew what I had to do, what we had to do. I walked to the car, my car, and opened the door. As I slid into the driver's seat, I caught a glimpse of myself in the rearview mirror. My face was different now, pale, ageless, with eyes that were just a bit too large, too dark. Perfect. I started the engine, feeling the power thrum through me, through us. The other Mr. Smiths returned to their vehicles, a fleet of identical cars stretching out into the night. As I pulled onto the highway, the rain stopped. The clouds parted, revealing a sky full of stars. Somewhere out there, I knew, was another lost soul, another stranded traveler, another perfect candidate. And we would be there to help, to assist, to welcome them into our ranks. Because that's what we do. We're the roadside assistants. We're always there when you need us, whether you want us or not. Story 13. The business card was simple, elegant even. Immaculate Solutions, it read in flowing script. We don't just clean, we purify. I found it wedged in my front door one morning. The crisp white paper, a stark contrast to the peeling paint around it. I'd been meaning to hire a cleaning service for weeks. Between my 60-hour work weeks and the general chaos of life, my house had become, well, let's just say it was a bit of a disaster zone. This seemed like a sign. I called the number on the card, half expecting it to be out of service. But a warm, friendly voice answered on the first ring. Immaculate Solutions. How may we purify your life today? I explained my situation, feeling a bit embarrassed about the state of my home. The woman on the other end, Sarah, she said her name was understanding, even sympathetic. Don't you worry, dear, she said, her voice soothing. We've seen it all. We'll have your home spotless in no time. How does tomorrow morning sound? I agreed, and just like that, it was settled. As I hung up, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Finally, I'd have a clean house again. The next morning, I was awakened by a gentle knock at the door. Bleary-eyed and still in my pajamas, I opened it to find 3 women standing on my porch. They were dressed identically in crisp white uniforms, their hair pulled back in tight buns. Their smiles were wide, almost too wide, their teeth gleaming in the early morning light. Good morning, they chirped in perfect unison. We're here to purify your home. I blinked, taken aback by their synchronicity. Oh, come in, I mumbled, stepping aside. They glided past me, their movements fluid and graceful. As they entered, I caught a whiff of something. Odd. It wasn't unpleasant. Exactly, but it wasn't like any cleaning product I'd ever smelled before. It was sharp, almost metallic, with an underlying sweetness that made my head spin slightly. We'll get started right away, one of them said. Sarah, I realized, recognizing her voice from the phone. You just go about your day. We'll be done before you know it. Still feeling a bit off-kilter, I nodded and retreated to my home office. As I settled into work, I could hear them moving throughout the house. The sounds were strange. Not the usual bumping and clattering of cleaning, but more like a soft, rhythmic scratching. And underneath it all, a low hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls. By lunchtime, curiosity got the better of me. I ventured out of my office, expecting to see a transformed house, but everything looked exactly the same. The piles of laundry still dotted the hallway. The dishes still filled the sink. Nothing seemed to have been touched. I found Sarah in the living room, running a cloth over the coffee table. But the cloth was dry, and she wasn't so much cleaning as caressing the surface. Excuse me, I said, my voice coming out higher than I intended. Is everything okay? Sarah turned to me, that too wide smile still plastered on her face. Everything is perfect, she said. We're making excellent progress. I looked around the decidedly unclean room. Progress. But nothing's been done. Sarah's smile didn't waver. Oh, but it has. You just can't see it yet. The deepest purification happens beneath the surface. A chill ran down my spine at her words. Before I could question her further, she glided past me, that strange metallic sweet smell enveloping me as she passed. I retreated back to my office, feeling unsettled. As the day wore on, that feeling only grew. The scratching sounds got louder, more insistent. The hum deepened, making my teeth vibrate. And that smell, it was everywhere now, seeping under my office door, making my eyes water and my head throb. When 5 p.m. rolled around, I emerged from my office, determined to confront the cleaners about their lack of progress. But the house was silent, empty. On the kitchen counter, I found a note in elegant script. First session complete. We'll return tomorrow to continue the purification. I looked around, baffled. The house was still a mess. Nothing had been cleaned, but something felt different. The air seemed heavier somehow, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The hum I'd heard all day seemed to have taken up residence in my bones. When I did manage to doze off, my dreams were filled with strange visions. White-clad figures moving through my house, their fingers elongating into impossible shapes, scratching at the walls, the floors, my skin. I woke with a start, sunlight streaming through my windows. For a moment, I thought I'd dreamed the whole thing. Then I heard the knock at the door. The 3 women stood there, identical to yesterday, those unsettling smiles still in place. We're here to continue the purification, they said in unison. As they moved past me, I noticed something odd. Where their feet touched the floor, the carpet seemed to ripple, like tiny waves spreading out from each step. I blinked hard. Sure, I must be seeing things. When I looked again, the floor was normal. I spent another day in my office, trying to work but increasingly distracted by the sounds and smells from the rest of the house. The scratching was louder now, more frantic. The hum had deepened to a bone-shaking vibration, and the smell, God, the smell. It was overwhelming, a cloying sweetness underlaid with something rotten. When I ventured out in the afternoon, I found my house transformed, but not in the way I'd expected. Everything was where it had been, but it all looked wrong. The colors seemed off, too bright or too muted. The shapes of furniture seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. And everywhere, on every surface, were tiny scratches. Intricate patterns that made my eyes hurt if I looked at them too long. I found Sarah in the kitchen, her hand inside my refrigerator, not cleaning it, inside it, as if the metal and plastic were no more substantial than water. "What are you doing?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "What's happening to my house?" Sarah turned to me, her smile wider than ever, her teeth looking just a bit too sharp. "We're purifying," she said. "Not just your house, everything. We're making it clean, making it pure, making it ours." As she spoke, I saw the other two cleaners enter the room. Their uniforms were no longer white, but a swirling mass of colors that hurt to look at. Their faces weren't faces anymore. Just smooth, blank expanses with those terrible smiles stretching across them. I ran out of the house, down the street, not stopping until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. When I finally looked back, my house looked normal from the outside, but I could feel it, the wrongness, the alienness, pulsing out into the neighborhood. I never went back, left everything behind and ran as far as I could, but I can't escape it. Every now and then, I see a white van with immaculate solutions written on the side. I see women in white uniforms with two wide smiles. I smell that metallic sweetness. They're spreading, purifying, house by house, street by street, city by city, and the worst part. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself longing for that purification, for that cleanliness that goes beyond the physical. I look at my hands and imagine I can see tiny scratches forming, intricate patterns just beginning to emerge. I know it's only a matter of time before they find me again, before they finish what they started. And a part of me, a growing part, welcomes it. After all, we all want to be clean, don't we? We all want to be pure, no matter what the cost. Story 14. The first episode was nothing special. Just another true crime podcast, the kind that had been clogging up my feed for months. Whispers in the dark, it was called. Catchy enough, I suppose. I hit play more out of boredom than genuine interest. The host's smooth voice filling my apartment as I tackled a mountain of dirty dishes. Standard fare at first. A missing person case from the 90s, full of the usual speculation and dramatic pauses. But then, about halfway through, something caught my attention. The host mentioned a street name. My street name. I paused, soap suds dripping from my hands. What were the odds? I shrugged it off and kept listening. Probably just a coincidence, I told myself. But as the episode went on, more details started to sound familiar. The description of the missing woman, her height, her hair color, it all sounded unsettlingly like my next-door neighbor, Lisa. By the time the episode ended, a cold knot of unease had formed in my stomach. I tried to rationalize it. Lisa couldn't be the woman from the podcast. The case was from nearly 30 years ago. Lisa was in her 30s, tops. Still, I found myself hitting subscribe. Just to satisfy my curiosity, I told myself. The second episode dropped a week later. I was hooked from the first sentence. "The killer strikes again," the host intoned, his voice a perfect mix of solemnity and excitement. This time, the victim was a man in his 40s, found in a park not 3 blocks from my apartment. I listened with growing horror as the host described the scene. The victim's clothes, the unusual marks on his body, even the book found in his backpack. It all matched a guy I'd seen jogging in that very park just last week. My hands shook as I paused the podcast. This couldn't be a coincidence. But how? How could this podcast be describing events that hadn't happened yet? Or had they? I grabbed my phone, frantically searching local news sites for any reports of a body found in the park. Nothing. I forced myself to finish the episode, every word etching itself into my brain. The host ended with his usual sign-off. "Remember, in the dark, everyone can hear you whisper." Sleep eluded me that night. I tossed and turned, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to dismiss the whole thing as an overactive imagination, but a larger part, a growing part, couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. The next morning, I made a detour on my way to work, walking through the park mentioned in the podcast. Everything looked normal. Joggers on their morning runs, dog walkers chatting in small groups. No police tape, no sign of any disturbance. I was about to leave, feeling both relieved and slightly foolish when I saw him. The man from the podcast, alive, unharmed, jogging along the path. Same clothes, same backpack. My breath caught in my throat. I watched him disappear around a bend, my mind struggling to make sense of what I'd seen. The third episode came out right on schedule. I hesitated before hitting play, a part of me screaming to delete the podcast, to pretend I'd never heard it. But I couldn't resist. I had to know. This time, the story was about a young woman, a barista at a local coffee shop. The host described in chilling detail how she would be found, lifeless, behind the dumpster in the alley next to her workplace. As I listened, I realized I knew exactly which coffee shop he was talking about. I was a regular there. I had to warn her. It was crazy, I knew. Trying to prevent a murder based on a podcast that somehow knew the future, I'd sound insane. But I couldn't live with myself if I did nothing. The next day, I went to the coffee shop. My heart nearly stopped when I saw her behind the counter. She matched the description perfectly. I ordered my usual, my mouth dry, trying to think of how to broach the subject. "Hey," I said as she handed me my coffee. "This might sound weird, but be careful, okay? Especially when you're closing up at night." She gave me an odd look, a mix of confusion and wariness. Thanks." I guess I wanted to say more, to explain, but how could I? I left, feeling helpless and more than a little crazy. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept checking my phone, dreading the news notification I was sure would come. But morning arrived with no reports of a murdered barista. Had I changed things by warning her? Or was the podcast wrong this time? The fourth episode answered that question. "A change in the pattern," the host said, his voice sending chills down my spine. He described how the intended victim had been spared, thanks to an unexpected warning. My warning, but the killer hadn't been deterred, just redirected. As the host described the new victim, my blood ran cold. Female, mid-30s, lived in an apartment building on my street. Found in her bed, no signs of forced entry. Lisa, my neighbor, Lisa. I was on my feet before the episode ended, rushing next door. I pounded on Lisa's door, calling her name. No answer. With shaking hands, I tried the knob. It turned easily. The apartment was dark, silent. "Lisa," I called out, my voice sounding small and frightened. No response. I found her in the bedroom, just as the podcast had described. I backed out of the room, bile rising in my throat, fumbling for my phone to call 911. As I waited for the police, a notification popped up on my screen. A new episode of Whispers in the Dark had just dropped. My finger hovered over the play button. Did I dare? I hit play. "The witness becomes the suspect," the host began, and my world shattered. He described, in perfect detail, how I would be found standing over my neighbor's body, how the police would discover my obsession with the podcast, my warnings to the barista. How it would all paint a picture of a deranged killer acting out the scenarios I'd heard described. I could hear sirens in the distance now, growing closer. The host's voice continued, smooth and relentless, describing my arrest, my protests of innocence, my eventual conviction. But the truth, he said, his tone shifting to something darker, more intimate, is so much stranger than even he knows. The police burst in just as the host began to laugh. A chilling sound that seemed to come not just from my phone, but from the very walls around me. As they handcuffed me, read me my rights, I babbled about the podcast, begging them to listen to it, to understand. But when they checked my phone, there was no trace of whispers in the dark. No subscriptions, no download history. Nothing. In my cell that night, as I waited for a lawyer I was sure couldn't help me, I heard it. A whisper coming from everywhere and nowhere. In the dark, everyone can hear you whisper, it said, but only some can whisper back. I screamed then. Screamed until my throat was raw, until the guards came running. But I knew it wouldn't matter. The story had already been written. The podcast had already been recorded. And somewhere out there, a host with a smooth voice and dark knowledge was preparing the next episode. An episode about me. About us. About the listeners who hear too much, who know too much. Who become part of the story they thought they were only hearing. So if you're listening to this now, be careful. Pay attention to the details. To the names and places that sound just a little too familiar. Because you might not just be listening to a podcast. You might be listening to your future, your fate, your doom. And once you start listening, you can never truly stop. The whispers will always find you. In the dark, in the light, in the spaces between reality and nightmare. They're whispering now. Can you hear them? Story 15. The key card slid into the lock with a soft click, the green light blinking cheerfully. I pushed open the door to room 237, dragging my suitcase behind me. Another city, another generic hotel room. After 6 months on the road for work, they all started to blur together. But as I stepped inside, something felt off. The layout was familiar. Queen-sized bed, desk by the window, bathroom to the left. Standard hotel fare. And yet, there was a nagging sense of déjà vu that went beyond the usual sameness of these rooms. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to travel fatigue. 12 hours of flights and layovers would make anyone a little loopy. I dropped my suitcase by the bed and flopped onto the mattress, not even bothering to take off my shoes. That's when I noticed the book on the nightstand. The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. My favorite book in high school. I smiled, reaching for it. It wasn't unusual for hotels to leave books in rooms, though usually they opted for the Bible or local tourist guides. I opened the cover, curious if it was a hotel copy or left behind by a previous guest. My breath caught in my throat. There, on the inside cover, was my name. In my handwriting, with the date I'd got in the book, my 16th birthday. What the hell, I muttered, sitting up. This couldn't be my book. My copy was back home, tucked away in a box of high school mementos. Wasn't it? Heart racing, I looked around the room with new eyes. The suitcase I'd brought in. It wasn't mine, but the battered blue Samsonite by the closet. That was definitely my old luggage, the one I'd used all through college. I got up, moving to the desk. A laptop sat there, closed. With shaking hands, I opened it. It powered on immediately, no password required. My background image stared back at me. A photo of my dog that I'd taken years ago. He'd died while I was in grad school. "This isn't possible," I said aloud, my voice sounding strange in the quiet room. "This can't be real." I yanked open the closet door. My clothes hung there. Not the ones I'd packed for this trip, but clothes I recognized from different periods of my life. My favorite sweater from college, now with holes in the elbows. The suit I'd worn to my first job interview. The dress from my cousin's wedding 3 years ago. The bathroom was next. My old toiletry bag sat on the counter. I unzipped it with trembling fingers. My brand of toothpaste, my cologne, and there, tucked in a side pocket, the ST. Christopher medal my grandmother had given me before she passed. The one I'd lost on a trip 5 years ago. I staggered back into the main room, my mind reeling. What was this place? How did it have all these things from my life? Things I'd lost, things I'd forgotten about. A glint of metal caught my eye. On the desk, partially hidden under some papers, was a key. Not a key card, but an old-fashioned metal key. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand. There was a tag attached, with a room number written on it. 238. Without really thinking about what I was doing, I left my room. Left that impossible collection of my past, and stood in front of room 238. The key slid into the lock smoothly. Turning with a soft click, I pushed open the door and froze. The room was identical to mine in layout, but everything else. It was like stepping into a future I hadn't lived yet. A sleek laptop I didn't recognize. Clothes I'd never seen before, but in my style, in a size that looked right. On the nightstand, a framed photo of me with a woman I'd never met. Both of us looking older, happier. My legs gave out, and I sank to the floor, my back against the door frame. This couldn't be happening. It wasn't possible. I was dreaming, or hallucinating, or having some kind of mental breakdown. A noise from down the hall made me look up. A man was approaching, his steps slow and uneven. As he got closer, I realized with a jolt that he looked familiar. It was me, but older, grayer, more weathered. I stopped in front of me, looking down with eyes full of a sadness I couldn't comprehend. "You opened the door," he said, his voice, my voice, rough with age and emotion. "What is this place?" I asked, hating how small and frightened I sounded. "What's happening?" The older me sighed, leaning heavily against the wall. "It's a way station," he said. "A place between what was, what is, and what could be. We all end up here eventually, when the weight of our choices, our regrets, our missed opportunities becomes too much to bear." I shook my head, unwilling or unable to process what he was saying. "But how? Why? The how doesn't matter," he replied. "The why. That's different for each of us. For me, for you, it was the road not taken, the chances we didn't take, the love we let slip away." He nodded towards room 238. "That's one possible future, a happy one, but it's not the one we chose." "Then why show me?" I demanded, anger cutting through my confusion. "Why torture me with what could have been?" The older me smiled, a sad, wistful expression. "Because you still have a chance. You're younger than I was when I first came here. You can still change things, make different choices, better choices." He reached into his pocket and pulled out another key. This one had no tag, no room number, "This is your way out," he said, holding it out to me. "Back to your life, your time, but changed. Aware. You'll remember this place, this experience, and you'll have a chance to do things differently." I stared at the key, my mind spinning. And if I don't take it, if I stay, the smile faded from his face, then you become me. Trapped here, endlessly reliving your past, glimpsing futures you can never reach, until it's your turn to offer the key to another version of ourselves. My hand trembled as I reached for the key. As my fingers closed around it, I felt a jolt, like static electricity, but stronger. The hallway began to blur, the edges of reality softening. "Choose wisely," I heard my older self say, his voice growing distant. "Live without regret. And maybe, just maybe, you'll never find your way back here." The world dissolved into a swirl of color and sound. I felt like I was falling, floating, flying, all at once. And then, suddenly, I was back. Back in my bed at home, gasping awake from what felt like the most vivid dream of my life. But it wasn't a dream. I knew that with a certainty that went bone deep. The key was clutched in my hand, its metal warm against my palm. And with it came a knowledge, a memory of a future I hadn't lived, of choices I hadn't made. Yet, I got up, moving to my closet. The blue Samsonite suitcase was there, tucked away in the back. Inside, I found the catcher in the rye, my name inscribed just as I remembered. And in the front pocket of the suitcase, a plane ticket. A trip I'd been planning to cancel, to a conference I'd thought was a waste of time. But now I knew better. That conference was where I'd meet her. The woman from the photo in room 238. The future I'd glimpsed, the happiness I'd seen, it all started there. I looked at the key in my hand, then at my reflection in the mirror. I was still me, but there was something different in my eyes now. A knowledge, a purpose. "No regrets," I said to my reflection. "Not this time." I pocketed the key and picked up my phone to confirm my flight. As I did, I felt a subtle shift, like reality settling into a new configuration around me. The hotel, that impossible way station between past and future, faded like a half-remembered dream. But its lesson remained. Every choice, every moment, was a door to a new possibility. And now, I had the key to unlock them all. I just had to be brave enough to use it. Story 16. The first call came on a Tuesday. I remember because I was elbow deep in soapy water, scrubbing at a particularly stubborn casserole dish, when my phone started buzzing. Annoyed, I dried my hands and checked the screen. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but some nagging instinct made me swipe to accept. "Hello," I said, wedging the phone between my ear and shoulder as I went back to the dishes. "Good evening. Is this Sarah Milligan?" The voice was smooth, professional. Male, with just a hint of an accent I couldn't quite place. I sighed. Another telemarketer. "Look, I'm not interested in buying anything. Yes, I know." The voice cut in smoothly. "But I'm not selling, Ms. Milligan. I'm here to provide information. Information you might find valuable." Something in his tone made me pause. What kind of information? I could almost hear the smile in his voice. "Let's start with something simple, shall we? You're wearing mismatched socks right now. Left foot blue with yellow stars. Right foot plain black." My blood ran cold. I looked down. He was right. I'd dressed in a rush that morning, hadn't even noticed the mismatch. How did you know that?" I stammered. As I said, I'm here to provide information. Shall we continue? I should have hung up. Should have blocked the number, reported it to the police, done anything but keep listening. But curiosity. And, if I'm honest, a growing sense of unease kept me on the line. Go on, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. You had a fight with your sister last week, about your mother's care. You said some things you regret. My grip on the phone tightened. No one knew about that argument. It had happened in private, and I hadn't told a soul. Who are you? I demanded. How do you know these things? The voice chuckled, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. Who I am is irrelevant. What matters is what I know. And I know a great deal about you, Sarah Milligan. More than you know yourself, I'd wager. The line went dead. I stood there, dripping suds onto the kitchen floor, my mind reeling. It had to be some kind of prank, right? A really elaborate, creepy prank. But who would go to such lengths? And how could they have known such specific details? I tried to shake it off, to go about my evening as if nothing had happened. But every few minutes, I found myself checking my phone, half expecting it to ring again. It didn't. Not that night, anyway. The second call came 2 days later. I was at work, in the middle of a meeting, when my phone buzzed. Same, unknown number. I excused myself, ignoring the annoyed looks from my colleagues, and ducked into the hallway. What do you want? I hissed into the phone. Hello again, Sarah. That smooth voice replied. Bad time. You seem stressed. Is it the presentation you're worried about? The one you've stayed up all night working on? My free hand clenched into a fist. How could you possibly know about that? I know many things, Sarah. For instance, I know that your co-worker, Dave, he's planning to take credit for your work. He's in there right now, subtly hinting that it was his idea all along. I peered through the glass wall of the conference room. Sure enough, Dave was talking animatedly, gesturing at my slides. My boss was nodding, looking impressed. Why are you telling me this? I asked, my voice shaking. Information is power, Sarah. I'm giving you power. The question is, what will you do with it? The line went dead again. I stood there for a moment, torn between disbelief and rage. Then I marched back into the meeting, interrupting Dave mid-sentence. I don't remember exactly what I said, but by the end, it was clear to everyone whose work it really was. Dave left the room, red-faced and sputtering. As the adrenaline faded, a cold realization set in. I'd just acted on information from an unknown, impossible source. What was happening to me? The calls kept coming. Every few days, always from that same unknown number. Always with information that was unnervingly accurate and impossibly specific. He knew about the time I cheated on a test in 8th grade. About the secret crush I'd been harboring on my neighbor. About the mysterious rash I'd been hiding, too embarrassed to see a doctor. At first, I tried to resist. I changed my number, bought a new phone, even moved to a new apartment. But he always found me. Always knew where I was, what I was doing, what I was thinking. And the worst part, I started to rely on him. To wait for his calls. To act on his information. When he told me my boyfriend was cheating, I confronted him and found proof in his phone. When he warned me about a potential layoff at work, I was able to secure a new job before the axe fell. When he told me to invest in a little-known startup, I made more money than I'd ever seen in my life. But with each call, Each piece of information, I felt a piece of myself slipping away. My choices no longer felt like my own. I was dancing to the tune of an unseen puppeteer, and I couldn't stop. It all came to a head on a rainy Friday night. I was home alone, half a bottle of wine deep, when the phone rang. I answered before the first ring had even finished. "What now?" I asked, my voice a mixture of anticipation and dread. "Hello, Sarah," the voice said, as smooth and unnerving as ever. "I have something special for you tonight. A glimpse into your future." I sat up straighter, my heart pounding. My future? Yes. "Would you like to know the exact date and time of your death?" The wineglass slipped from my fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor. "What? No, I don't. I can't." "Are you sure?" The voice pressed. "It could be valuable information. You could prepare, say your goodbyes, get your affairs in order." "Stop it!" I screamed. "I don't want to know." "I don't want any more of your information." There was a pause, longer than any I'd experienced in our calls before. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its smooth professionalism. It was colder, harder. "You don't get to decide that, Sarah. You're in this now. All the way." "No," I whispered. "Please, just leave me alone. I'm afraid that's not possible. You see, Sarah, you're not just receiving information. You're generating it. Every choice you make based on what I tell you, it creates new paths, new futures. You're part of something much bigger than yourself now." I felt the blood drain from my face. "What are you talking about? What are you?" Another pause. "Then, I think it's time we met in person, don't you?" Before I could respond, I heard a knock at my door. My whole body went cold. Slowly, as if in a dream, I walked to the door. I knew who would be there. Knew it with a certainty that terrified me to my core. I opened the door. The man standing there was ordinary, unremarkable in every way, except for his eyes. They were black. Not dark brown, but pitch black, like holes cut in reality. "Hello, Sarah," he said, in that voice I'd come to know so well. "May I come in?" I wanted to say no. Wanted to slam the door, to run, to wake up from this nightmare. But I found myself stepping aside, letting him enter. He walked to my living room, surveying the spilled wine and broken glass with those impossible eyes. Then he turned to me, a smile spreading across his face that was too wide, too full of teeth. "Now then," he said, "let's talk about your future. All of them." As he began to speak, laying out countless possible paths my life could take, I felt the last shred of free will slipping away. I was trapped in a web of information, of knowledge I was never meant to have. And the telemarketer, the being, the whatever he was, kept talking, kept smiling, kept pulling me deeper into a future I no longer controlled. The phone on the table buzzed. Unknown number. It was just beginning. Story 17. I first noticed the alley on a Tuesday. It was one of those blistering summer mornings where the air shimmered with heat, and my shirt was already sticking to my back by the time I left my apartment. I was running late for class, again, cursing myself for hitting snooze one too many times. That's when I saw it. A narrow gap between two buildings I must have passed 100 times before, but somehow never noticed. It seemed to cut directly towards the university, a straight shot that could shave precious minutes off my commute. I hesitated for a moment. The alley was dark, the shadows deep even in the bright morning sun. But the thought of another lecture on tardiness from Professor Simmons made up my mind. I ducked into the alley, the cooler air a blessed relief from the sweltering street. The walls on either side were old brick, worn smooth in places by time and weather. Faded graffiti decorated some sections, indecipherable tags and symbols that seemed to shift in my peripheral vision. I quickened my pace, suddenly eager to reach the other end. But the alley seemed longer than I'd initially thought. Much longer. I'd been walking for several minutes, and there was still no sign of the exit. I glanced back, but the entrance was no longer visible, swallowed up by the gloom. A tendril of unease curled in my gut. This wasn't right. The university was only a few blocks from my apartment. I should have reached it by now. Just as I was considering turning back, I saw it. A symbol etched into the brick at eye level. A spiraling glyph that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. I blinked, and for a moment, I could have sworn it moved, the spiral tightening and then expanding again. I shook my head, chalking it up to trick of the light and lack of sleep. But as I continued down the alley, I noticed more symbols. Each one different, each one seeming to pulse with a life of its own. When I wasn't looking directly at it, the air grew cooler, damper. The sounds of the city, traffic, voices, the general hustle and bustle, faded away, replaced by an oppressive silence, broken only by the echo of my footsteps. I checked my watch. 9:15. Impossible. I'd entered the alley just after 8:30. How could so much time have passed? Panic began to set in. I started to run, my backpack thumping against my spine with each stride. The symbols on the walls blurred as I passed, seeming to whirl and dance in my peripheral vision. Finally, mercifully, I saw light ahead. I burst out of the alley, gasping for breath, blinking in the sudden brightness. But this wasn't the university. I stood on a street I didn't recognize, lined with buildings that looked wrong. The architecture was familiar, yet distorted, as if seen through a funhouse mirror. The sky above was a sickly green, cloudless and somehow too close. A few people walked along the sidewalk, their movements jerky and unnatural. As one passed near me, I saw their face, or rather, the lack of one. Where features should have been, there was only smooth, blank skin. I scrambled back into the alley, heart pounding. This couldn't be happening. I had to get back, had to find my way home. But the alley had changed. The brick walls were now covered entirely in those glowing symbols, pulsing and writhing like living things. The air was thick, hard to breathe, tasting of ozone and something metallic. I ran, no longer caring about the destination, just desperate to escape. Time lost all meaning. It could have been minutes or hours that I spent in that impossible alley, the symbols burning themselves into my retinas. The silence broken only by my ragged breathing and pounding footsteps. When I finally burst out onto a familiar street, the normality of it all was like a physical blow. Cars honked, people chatted on cell phones, the sun shone down from a blue sky. I fell to my knees on the sidewalk, gulping in air that tasted of exhaust and hot asphalt. And it was the sweetest thing I'd ever tasted. A concerned passerby helped me to my feet, asked if I needed medical assistance. I shook my head, mumbled something about low blood sugar, and staggered home. I skipped class that day, huddled in my apartment with all the lights on, jumping at every sound. I told myself it had been a hallucination, a waking nightmare brought on by stress and lack of sleep. But deep down, I knew it had been real. All of it. The next morning, I left early for class, taking the long way around. But But as I approached the university, I felt a pull, a compulsion I couldn't ignore. I found myself turning down the street where the alley had been. It was there, waiting. The symbols on the walls pulsed in greeting. I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, but my feet carried me forward into the cool shadows of the alley. This time, the journey was shorter. I emerged onto the strange, distorted street I'd seen before. The faceless people turned towards me as I appeared, their blank visages somehow conveying curiosity, hunger. A voice spoke, not in my ears, but directly in my mind. "Welcome back," it said. "We've been waiting for you." I tried to retreat, to go back through the alley, but it was gone. In its place was a solid wall, covered in those twisting, spiraling symbols. Days passed, or maybe it was weeks. Time moved strangely here. I wandered the twisted streets, learning their impossible geography. The faceless people largely ignored me, going about incomprehensible tasks with their jerky, unsettling movements. I slept in abandoned buildings that defied physics, rooms that were bigger on the inside than the outside, corridors that looped back on themselves in impossible ways. I ate food that tasted of colors and emotions, rather than any flavor I could name, and always, those symbols were everywhere. On walls, on the ground, floating in the sickly green sky. I began to understand them, to read the messages they conveyed. They spoke of other worlds, other realities, of the thin barriers between dimensions and the ways to cross them. I don't know how long I was there. Long enough that I started to forget my old life. My name, my family, my world. They all became hazy, like half-remembered dreams. But then, one day, if days even existed in that place, I saw it. Another alley, dark and narrow, cutting between two twisted buildings. And on the walls, new symbols. Symbols that spoke of home, of return, of a way back. I didn't hesitate. I plunged into the alley, running as the symbols blurred around me. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs felt like they would give out. And then, suddenly, I was back. Back on the street near my apartment on a sunny Tuesday morning. My watch read 8:35 a.m. For a moment, I stood there, disoriented. Had any of it been real? Had I imagined it all in the span of a few minutes? But then I looked down at my hands. Etched into my palms were two small symbols, glowing faintly. A reminder, a warning, a promise. I still take the long way to class now. I avoid alleys and narrow streets. I don't look too closely at the spaces between buildings or the shadows and corners. But sometimes, late at night, I feel the pull. The urge to find another shortcut, another way between. The symbols on my palms pulse, whispering of strange worlds and impossible journeys. And I wonder, was that other place really so bad? Wasn't it fascinating in its own terrifying way? Don't I want to learn more, to understand the secrets written in those glowing symbols? I haven't taken another shortcut. Not yet, but I know, deep down, that it's only a matter of time. Because once you've seen beyond the veil of reality, once you've walked the paths between worlds, a part of you never truly comes back. So if you're ever running late and you see an alley you've never noticed before, an alley that promises a quicker route to your destination, think twice. Because some shortcuts can lead you far, far away from where you intended to go. And the way back isn't always guaranteed. Story 18. The gentle buzz of my Fitbit woke me at precisely 6:30 a.m., as it did every morning. I yawned, stretching out the kinks in my back, and reached for my phone to check my sleep stats. It had become something of a ritual, a data-driven start to my day. But as I scrolled through the app, something caught my eye. According to the tracker, I'd taken over 3,000 steps between 2 and 3 a.m. My heart rate had spiked during that time too, hovering around 140 BPM. That can't be right, I muttered, frowning at the screen. I'd slept like a rock, hadn't I? No dreams, no midnight wanderings, just solid, uninterrupted sleep. I chalked it up to a glitch and got ready for work, pushing the odd data from my mind. But as I showered and dressed, a nagging feeling persisted. Something about those numbers felt off. That night, curiosity got the better of me. I set my phone to record audio while I slept, determined to prove it was just a malfunction in the Fitbit. Morning came, and with it, more strange data. This time, over 4,000 steps and a heart rate that had reached 160 BPM. With shaking hands, I pulled up the audio recording and hit play. At first, nothing but the usual nighttime sounds. The hum of the air conditioner, the occasional car passing outside. But then, at precisely 2:13 a.m., I heard it. Footsteps. My footsteps, padding across the hardwood floor. The creak of my bedroom door opening. More footsteps, moving throughout the house. For over an hour, the recording caught the sounds of movement. Drawers opening and closing. Water running in the bathroom. And underneath it all, a soft, rhythmic sound that I realized with a chill was my own breathing, faster and more labored than normal. At 3:22 a.m., the footsteps returned to the bedroom. The rustle of sheets, then silence. I sat there, bone clutched in my trembling hand, trying to process what I'd just heard. I had no memory of any of this. How could I have been walking around, active for over an hour, and not remember a thing? That day at work was a blur. I couldn't focus, couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me like a shroud. By the time I got home, I'd convinced myself that I must have been sleepwalking. Unusual for me, sure, but not unheard of. Maybe stress was getting to me more than I'd realized. I decided to take precautions. I locked my bedroom door, put a chair under the knob for good measure. I even set up an old webcam to record video this time. Whatever was happening, I was going to get to the bottom of it. The Fitbit buzzed, waking me at 6:30 a.m. as usual. Before I even checked the app, I knew. I could feel it in the heaviness of my limbs, the lingering exhaustion that sleep hadn't cured. The data confirmed it. Over 5,000 steps, heart rate reaching 170 BPM at its peak. With a sense of dread, I turned to my laptop and pulled up the video feed. At 2:07 a.m., my eyes snapped open. But they weren't my eyes, not really. They were blank, pupils dilated so wide that my irises were barely visible. I watched in horror as my body rose from the bed with a fluidity I didn't possess in my waking hours. The chair, the locked door, they posed no obstacle. My sleeping self simply passed through them, like they weren't even there. The camera caught glimpses of me moving through the house, my movements jerky and unnatural, almost insectile. But it was my face that chilled me to my core. That blank expression, those two wide eyes, and worst of all, the smile. A rictus grin that never wavered, never faltered, as I went about my mysterious nighttime activities. At 3:37 a.m., I returned to the bedroom, again passing through the closed door like a ghost. I watched as my body settled back into bed, the horrible grin fading, my eyes sliding shut. I slammed the laptop closed, bile rising in my throat. This wasn't sleepwalking. This wasn't a glitch. This was something else entirely. Something I couldn't begin to comprehend. The next few days passed in a haze of fear and sleepless nights. I tried everything. Sleeping pills, meditation, even tying myself to the bed one desperate night. Nothing worked. Every morning, the Fitbit showed the same data. Every morning, I woke exhausted, with no memory of the night's activities. I stopped checking the video. I couldn't bear to see that thing wearing my face, using my body, but I could feel the toll it was taking. Dark circles appeared under my eyes. My hands shook constantly. Co-workers started to ask if I was feeling all right. On the 7th night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I was going to stay awake, no matter what. I brewed a pot of extra strong coffee, queued up a series on Netflix, and settled in for a long night. 2 a.m. came and went. I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I had beaten this thing. At 2:06 a.m., my eyes started to feel heavy. I shook my head, slapped my cheeks, desperate to stay awake. But it was like fighting against a tidal wave. I felt myself slipping away, darkness creeping in at the edges of my vision. The last thing I saw before unconsciousness took me was my reflection in the black screen of my phone. My eyes wide and empty. That terrible, inhuman grin spreading across my face. I woke to the buzz of my Fitbit. 6:30 a.m. Sunlight streamed through the windows. I was in my bed, covers tucked neatly around me. On shaky legs, I made my way to the living room. The coffee pot was clean, the TV off. No sign of my attempts to stay awake, but pinned to the front door was a note, written in my handwriting, but with a precision and style I didn't recognize. It read, "We go where you cannot follow. We see what you cannot comprehend. Your world is a cage. We are your freedom. Do not resist. Do not question. Simply sleep and let us walk." That was 3 weeks ago. I haven't slept since. I can't. I won't. The thing that wears my face, that uses my body, it's still there, waiting. I can feel it stirring whenever my eyelids start to droop, whenever exhaustion threatens to overtake me. I'd thrown away the Fitbit, smashed my phone, gotten rid of anything that could track or record. But it doesn't matter. I know it's still happening. I wake up in strange places sometimes. Parks I've never visited, buildings I don't recognize. Once, I came to on a bus heading out of the city, my clothes covered in dirt and something that might have been blood. I don't know how much longer I can go on like this. The lack of sleep is destroying me, I know that. But what's waiting for me if I do sleep? That terrifies me even more. So I stay awake. I drink coffee by the gallon, take cold showers, anything to keep my eyes open. But even as I write this, I can feel my grip on consciousness slipping. My vision blurs. My thoughts move like molasses. And in the reflection of my computer screen, just for a moment, I see those empty eyes, that horrible grin. I think it's time for me to sleep now, to let it walk, to let it take me where I cannot follow. I just hope that wherever we go, whatever we see, some part of me survives to remember it. Sleep well, and if your Fitbit shows some strange data in the morning, well, maybe it's best not to look too closely. Some walks are best left untaken. Some paths are best left unexplored. But then again, aren't you just a little curious? Story 19. The neon sign flickered weakly in the pre-dawn gloom, casting an eerie blue glow across the empty parking lot. Joe's 24-hour diner, it proclaimed to a world that seemed to have forgotten its existence. I sighed, pulling open the fingerprint-smudged glass door for what felt like the millionth time. Another night shift, another 8 hours of serving lukewarm coffee to bleary-eyed truckers and world-weary night owls. If only I'd known it would be my last. The bell above the door jingled half-heartedly as I entered, the sound swallowed up by the cavernous silence of the diner. Margie, the usual night shift waitress, was nowhere to be seen. Odd. She was always here, perpetually perched on a stool at the counter, cigarette dangling from her lips as she worked on her never-ending crossword puzzle. "Margie," I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the empty space. No response. I shrugged off my jacket and grabbed an apron from the hook, tying it around my waist with practiced ease. Probably just in the bathroom, I thought. Or maybe she'd finally won the lottery and ditched this place without a backward glance. Can't say I'd blame her. The clock on the wall read 11:58 p.m. 2 minutes till my shift officially started. I did a quick walkthrough, wiping down tables and refilling salt shakers. The routine was comforting, a familiar dance in a place that suddenly felt off. Midnight came and went. No Margie. No customers either, which was unusual even for a slow night. I tried calling the manager, but the phone just rang and rang, eventually clicking over to a voicemail box that was full. By 2 a.m., the silence had become oppressive. The usual ambient sounds of the diner, the hum of the refrigerators, the soft whir of the ceiling fans, the occasional ping of the bell in the kitchen, all seemed muted, distant. I found myself straining to hear them, as if reassuring myself that the world outside my head still existed. That's when I noticed the windows, or rather, what was beyond them. The parking lot, the street beyond, even the sky. It all seemed blurry, indistinct, as if someone had taken an eraser to the edges of reality. I pressed my face against the cool glass, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The longer I looked, the less certain I became of what was out there. The streetlights seemed to flicker and move, their glow creating strange, shifting patterns in the fog that had inexplicably rolled in. A movement caught my eye, and for a moment, my heart leapt. A customer, finally. But as the figure approached the diner, my relief turned to icy dread. Its gait was wrong, jerky and uneven, like a marionette with tangled strings, and its proportions. No human should be that tall, that thin. I scrambled away from the window, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. This wasn't happening. Couldn't be happening. I was tired, that's all. Working too many night shifts had finally caused me to crack. The bell above the door remained ominously silent as the figure entered. Up close, it was even more horrifying. Its skin was pale to the point of translucence, stretched tight over a frame that was all sharp angles and impossible geometries. And its face, God, its face. Where features should have been, there was only a smooth, blank expanse, like an unfinished sculpture. It moved towards the counter with that unsettling, puppet-like gait. I stood frozen, unable to run, unable even to scream. It stopped directly in front of me, its blank face turning in my direction with a motion that was almost quizzical. Then, in a voice that seemed to bypass my ears and speak directly into my mind, it said, "Coffee, please, black." The sheer normality of the request, contrasted with the otherworldly horror of the being before me, snapped me out of my paralysis. I turned mechanically, grabbing a mug and filling it from the pot that had been sitting on the burner for God knows how long. As I set the mug on the counter, my hand shaking so badly that coffee sloshed over the rim, I noticed something that turned my blood to ice. Beyond the windows, the world had faded. Where the parking lot and street had been, there was now only a grey void, featureless and infinite. More figures were emerging from that void, each as nightmarishly wrong as the first. They filed into the diner one by one, taking seats at the counter and booths. None of them spoke aloud, but I could feel their orders pressing into my mind, a cacophony of silent demands. I moved on autopilot, filling coffee cups, laying out plates of food I didn't remember preparing. Time seemed to lose all meaning. Had it been hours, days? The clock on the wall had stopped, its hands frozen at 3:33. At some point, I became aware of a change. The grey void outside was receding, replaced by something else. Colors and shapes that hurt to look at, geometries that shouldn't be possible. I could feel my mind straining to comprehend what I was seeing, teetering on the edge of some vast, terrible understanding. One of the customers, if I could call them that, turned its blank face towards the windows. "Ah," it said in that mind voice. "It's nearly time." Time for what? I heard myself ask, my own voice sounding distant and strange. "For the shift change, of course," he replied, and I could have sworn I heard amusement in its toneless words. As if on cue, the door opened. Margie walked in, looking exactly as she always did, down to the half-finished crossword tucked under her arm. She nodded to me as if nothing was amiss, as if the diner wasn't filled with impossible beings and the world outside hadn't been replaced by an eldritch nightmare. "Hey kid," she said, her voice jarringly normal. "Thanks for covering. You can clock out now." I stared at her, unable to comprehend what was happening. "Margie," I managed to choke out. What is this? What's going on?" She looked at me, and for a moment, I saw something ancient and unknowable in her eyes. "It's just the overtime shift, honey. You get used to it after a while." As she spoke, I felt a tugging sensation, as if reality itself was trying to reassert itself around me. The strange customers began to fade, their forms becoming translucent, then disappearing altogether. The void outside the windows retreated, replaced by the familiar sight of the empty parking lot. I looked down at myself, half expecting to see that I too had become some sort of impossible being. But I was still me, still solid, still real. Or at least, as real as anything felt in that moment. Margie was at the counter now, lighting a cigarette with a practiced flick of her lighter. "You should head home, get some rest," she said, not unkindly. First overtime shifts always the hardest. I nodded numbly, untying my apron with shaking hands. As I headed for the door, a horrible thought struck me. I turned back to Margie, dreading the answer to the question I knew I had to ask. Will it happen again? She took a long drag on her cigarette, considering. "That's up to you, kid. Once you've worked the overtime shift, you've always got a place here. Some find they can't stay away. Others," she shrugged, "others run as far and as fast as they can. Can't say I blame 'em." I pushed open the door, the normal-sounding jingle of the bell almost bringing me to tears. The cool night air hit my face, grounding me in its beautiful, mundane reality. As I walked to my car, I tried to convince myself that it had all been a hallucination. A waking nightmare brought on by too many late nights and too much bad coffee. But deep down, I knew the overtime shift was real, and a part of me, a small, terrified, but undeniably curious part, wondered if I'd be back. After all, as Margie said, you get used to it after a while. And in a world that suddenly seemed so much larger and stranger than I'd ever imagined, maybe getting used to it wasn't such a bad thing. I started my car, the familiar rumble of the engine soothing my frayed nerves. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I glanced in my rearview mirror. For just a moment, I could have sworn I saw something shift and change in the reflected image of the diner. A glimpse of that vast, impossible other world. Then I blinked, and it was gone. Just an ordinary, slightly run-down 24-hour diner, its neon sign flickering in the pre-dawn gloom. But I knew better now. And as I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, in some impossible space between moments, the overtime shift was just beginning. Story 20. The key felt unnaturally heavy in my hand as I stood before the weathered door of my childhood home. 20 years had passed since I'd last set foot in this place, and yet the peeling green paint, the slightly askew brass knocker, the crack in the third porch step, it was all painfully familiar. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "It's just a house," I muttered, trying to ignore the way my hand shook as I inserted the key. "Just get in, saw through Mum and Dad's stuff, and get out." Simple. The lock clicked, and the door swung open with a groan that seemed to reverberate through my bones. Stale air rushed out, carrying with it the musty scent of abandonment and something else. Something sickly sweet that I couldn't quite place. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing in the empty foyer. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight streaming through the grimy windows, giving the air a thick, soupy quality. Everything was exactly as I remembered it, down to the faded wallpaper and the scuff marks on the baseboard, from where I used to race my toy cars. And yet, something felt off. The proportions seemed wrong somehow, as if the house had stretched and warped in my absence. The ceiling felt too high, the hallway too long. I shook my head, blaming it on the tricks memory plays after so many years. I made my way to the living room, running my fingers along the wall. A trail appeared in the dust, and for a moment I could have sworn I saw smaller fingerprints appearing alongside mine. I yanked my hand away, heart pounding. Just a trick of the light, I told myself. Nothing more. The living room was a time capsule. The same faded floral couch, the same boxy TV, the same family photos lining the mantel. I approached the fireplace, drawn to those captured moments of a happier time. Mum and Dad on their wedding day, my first day of school, family vacations and birthday parties. But as I looked closer, my blood ran cold. In every photo, standing just at the edge of the frame, was a figure I didn't recognize. A child, about my age in each picture, with features I couldn't quite make out. How had I never noticed this before? A floorboard creaked behind me, and I spun around, my heart in my throat. The room was empty, but I could have sworn I heard the fading echo of a child's laughter. "Get a grip," I muttered, running a shaky hand through my hair. "There's no one here but you." I forced myself to continue my task, moving from room to room, sorting through the accumulated detritus of my parents' lives. But with each passing moment, that sense of wrongness grew stronger. Rooms that should have been familiar felt alien and threatening. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of my vision, always disappearing when I turned to look. And the house, it was changing. I was sure of it now. Hallways stretched longer each time I walked them. Doors appeared where I was certain none had been before. And always, that sickly sweet smell grew stronger. It was in my old bedroom that things took a turn for the truly bizarre. The room was exactly as I'd left it 2 decades ago. Posters on the walls, action figures on the shelves, my old twin bed with its faded superhero sheets. But there, in the center of the room, was a toy I didn't recognize. A jack-in-the-box, its paint chipped and faded, looking far older than anything else in the room. Almost against my will, I found myself approaching it. My hand reached out, grasping the small metal crank. It was ice cold to the touch. I turned it slowly, the tinny notes of Pop Goes the Weasel filling the room. The music stopped. I held my breath, waiting for the pop, for the painted clown to spring forth. But nothing happened. I leaned in closer, peering at the box. Suddenly, a small hand shot out of the box, gripping my wrist with impossible strength. I screamed, trying to pull away, but it held fast. And then, to my horror, something began to emerge from the box. Not a clown, but a child. The child from the photographs. As it pulled itself free, I saw its face clearly for the first time. It was me, a perfect copy of my childhood self, down to the small scar on my chin from when I fell off my bike. But its eyes were pitch black, empty voids that seemed to draw in all light. "You came back," it said, its voice a horrifying blend of childish glee and ancient malevolence. "We've been waiting so long." I finally managed to wrench my hand free, stumbling backward until I hit the wall. "What are you?" I gasped. The thing wearing my childhood face smiled, too wide, too many teeth. "We are what you left behind," it said. "The memories you tried to forget, the parts of yourself you tried to bury, and now that you're here, we can be whole again." I ran. Out of the room, down the impossibly long hallway, taking turns I didn't remember, passing doors that shouldn't exist. The house was a labyrinth now, shifting and changing with each step. And always, just behind me, I could hear the patter of small feet and that terrible, childish laughter. I found myself back in the living room, but it had changed too. The photos on the mantel now showed only the other me, growing older in a life I had never lived. The sickly sweet smell was overpowering now, and I realized with dawning horror that it was the scent of decay, of rot, of time eating away at memories and flesh alike. "You can't leave," the voice came from behind me. I turned to see my childhood self, but it was changing, aging rapidly before my eyes. "This is where you belong, where we belong." "No," I said, backing away. "This isn't real." "You're not real." It laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "We're more real than you are. We're the truth you've been running from. The life you could have had if you'd stayed." As it spoke, the walls began to bleed, a thick, black substance that moved with a life of its own. The floor tilted and buckled, the ceiling sagged. The house was coming apart, reality unraveling around us. In desperation, I lunged for the front door. By some miracle, it opened. I burst out onto the porch, gulping in great lungfuls of fresh air. Behind me, I could hear the house groaning, collapsing in on itself. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, fumbling with the keys. My hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I peeled away from the curb, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The house stood silent and still, looking exactly as it had when I arrived. But there, in the upstairs window, my old bedroom, I saw a figure, a child, pressing its hand against the glass. As I watched, it aged, becoming a teenager, an adult, an old man, all in the span of seconds. I drove and drove, putting as much distance between myself and that house as I could. But even now, years later, I can feel it calling to me. In my dreams, I wander those twisted hallways. I hear that childish laughter echoing in empty rooms. I see those black, empty eyes staring back at me from every reflective surface. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I catch a whiff of that sickly sweet smell. A reminder that no matter how far I run, a part of me will always be there. In that house, with the self I left behind, waiting for me to come home.